The Necromancers by Robert Hugh Benson. Chapter 1. 1. "I'm very much distressed about it all," murmured Mrs. Baxter. She was a small, delicate-looking old lady, very true to type indeed, with the silvery hair of the devout widow crowned with an exquisite lace cap, in a filmy black dress, with a complexion of precious china, kind, short-sighted blue eyes, and white, blue-veined hands busy now upon needlework. She bore about with her always an atmosphere of piety, humble, tender, and sincere, but as persistent as the gentle sandalwood aroma which breathed from her dress. Her theory of the universe, as the girl who watched her now was beginning to find out, was impregnable and unapproachable. Events which conflicted with it were either not events, or they were so exceptional as to be negligible. If she were hard pressed, she emitted a pathetic peevishness that rendered further argument impossible. The room in which she sat reflected perfectly her personality. In spite of the early Victorian date of the furniture, there was in its arrangement and selection a taste so exquisite as to deprive it of even a suspicion of Philistinism. Somehow, the rosewood table on which the September morning sun fell with serene beauty did not conflict as it ought to have done with the Tudor paneling of the room. A tapestry screen veiled the door into the hall, and soft curtains of velvety gold hung on either side of the tall, modern windows leading to the garden. For the rest, the furniture was charming and suitable: low chairs, a tapestry couch, a multitude of little leather-covered books on every table, and two low-carved bookshelves on either side of the door filled with poetry and devotion. The girl, who sat upright with her hands on her lap, was of another type altogether, of that type which it is impossible to predicate anything except that it makes itself felt in every company. Any respectable astrologer would have had no difficulty in assigning her birth to the sign of the Scorpion. In outward appearance she was not remarkable, though extremely pleasing, and it was a pleasingness that grew upon acquaintance. Her beauty, such as it was based upon a good foundation, upon regular features, a slightly cleft rounded chin, a quantity of dark coiled hair, and large, steady, serene brown eyes. Her hands were not small, but beautifully shaped, her figure slender, well made, and always at ease in any attitude. In fact, she had an air of repose, strength, and all-around competence, and, contrasted with the other, she resembled a well-bred sheepdog eyeing an Angora cat. They were talking now about Laurie Baxter. "Dear Laurie is so impetuous and sensitive," murmured his mother, drawing her needle softly through the silk and then patting her material, "and it is all terribly sad." This was undeniable, and Maggie said nothing, though her lips opened as if for speech. Then she closed them again, and sat watching the twinkling fire of logs upon the hearth. Then once more Mrs. Baxter took up the tale. "When I first heard of the poor girl's death," she said, "it seemed to me so providential. It would have been too dreadful if he had married her. He was away from home, you know, on Thursday when it happened, but he was back here on Friday, and has been like a madman ever since. I've done what I could, but—" "Was she quite impossible?" asked the girl in her slow voice. "I never saw her, you know." Mrs. Baxter laid down her embroidery. "My dear, she was. Well, I have not a word against her character, of course. She was all that was good, I believe. But you know, her home, her father, well, what can you expect from a grocer? And a Baptist," she added with a touch of vindictiveness. "What was she like?" asked the girl, still with that meditative air. "My dear, she was like a picture on a chocolate box. I can say no more than that. She was little and fair-haired, with a very pretty complexion, and a ribbon in her hair always. Laurie brought her up here to see me, you know, in the garden. I felt I could not bear to have her in the house just yet, though, of course, it would have had to have come. She spoke very carefully, but there was an unmistakable accent. Once she left out an H, and then she said the word over again quite right." Maggie nodded gently with a certain air of pity, and Mrs. Baxter went on encouraged. "She had a little stammer that Laurie thought was very pretty, and she had a restless little way of playing with her fingers as if on a piano. Oh, my dear, it would have been too dreadful. And now, my poor boy." The old lady's eyes filled with compassionate tears, and she laid her sewing down to fetch out a little lace-fringed pocket handkerchief. Maggie leaned back with one easy movement in her low chair, clasping her hands behind her head, but she still said nothing. Mrs. Baxter finished the little ceremony of wiping her eyes, and, Still winking a little, bending over her needlework, continued the commentary. Do try to help him, my dear. That was why I asked you to come back yesterday. I wanted you to be in the house for the funeral. You see, Laurie's becoming a Catholic at Oxford has brought you two together. It's no good my talking to him about the religious side of it all. He thinks I know nothing at all about the next world, though, I'm sure. Tell me, said the girl suddenly, still in the same attitude. Has he been practicing his religion? You see, I haven't seen much of him this year, and I'm afraid not very well, said the old lady tolerantly. He thought he was going to be a priest at first, you remember, and I'm sure I should have made no objection, and then in the spring he seemed to be getting rather tired of it all. I don't think he gets on with Father Mahan very well. I don't think Father Mahan understands him quite. It was he, you know, who told him not to be a priest, and I think that discouraged poor Laurie. I see, said the girl shortly, and Mrs. Baxter applied herself again to her sewing. It was indeed a rather trying time for the old lady. She was a tranquil and serene soul, and it seemed as if she were doomed to live over a perpetual volcano. It was as pathetic as an amiable cat trying to go to sleep on a rifle range. She was developing the jumps. The first serious explosion had taken place 2 years before, when her son, then in his third year at Oxford, had come back with the announcement that Rome was the only home worthy to shelter his aspiring soul, and that he must be received into the Catholic Church in 6 weeks' time. She had produced little books for his edification as in duty bound. She had summoned Anglican divines to the rescue, but all had been useless, and Laurie had gone back to Oxford as an avowed proselyte. She had soon become accustomed to the idea, and indeed, when the first shock was over, had not greatly disliked it, since her own adopted daughter, of half-French parentage, Margaret Marie Deronay, had been educated in the same faith, and was an eminently satisfactory person. The next shock was Laurie's announcement of his intention to enter the priesthood, and perhaps the religious life as well. But this, too, had been tempered by the reflection that in that case Maggie would inherit the house and carry on its traditions in a suitable manner. Maggie had come to her upon leaving her convent school 3 years before, with a pleasant little income of her own, had come to her by an arrangement made previously to her mother's death, and her manner of life, her reasonableness, her adaptability, her presentableness had reassured the old lady considerably as to the tolerableness of the Roman Catholic religion. Indeed, once she had hoped that Laurie and Maggie might come to an understanding that would prevent all possible difficulty as to the future of his house and estate. But the fourth volcanic storm had once more sent the world flying into pieces about Mrs. Baxter's delicate ears, and, during the last 3 months, she had had to face the prospect of Laurie's bringing home as a bride the rather underbred, pretty, stammering, pink and white daughter of a Baptist grocer of the village. This had been a terrible affair altogether. Laurie, as is the custom of a certain kind of young male, had met, spoken to, and ultimately kissed this Amy Nugent on a certain summer evening as the stars came out, but with a chivalry not so common in such cases, had also sincerely and simply fallen in love with her, with a romance usually reserved for far better matched affections. It seemed, from Laurie's conversation, that Amy was possessed of every grace of body, mind, and soul required in one who was to be mistress of the great house. It was not, so Laurie explained, at all a milkmaid kind of affair. He was not the man, he said, to make a fool of himself over a pretty face. No, Amy was a rare soul, a flower growing on stony soil. Sandy, perhaps, would be the better word, and it was his deliberate intention to make her his wife. Then had followed every argument known to mothers, for it was not likely that even Mrs. Baxter would accept without a struggle a daughter-in-law who, 5 years before, had bobbed to her, wearing a pinafore and carrying in a pair of rather large hands a basket of eggs to her back door. Then she had consented to see the girl, and the interview in the garden had left her more distressed than ever. It was there that the H incident had taken place, and so the struggle had gone on. Laurie had protested, stormed, sulked, taken refuge in rhetoric and dignity alternately, and his mother had with gentle persistence objected, held her peace, argued, and resisted, conflicting step by step against the inevitable, seeking to reconcile her son by pathos and her God by petition. And then, in an instant, only 4 days ago, it seemed that the latter had prevailed, and today Laurie, in a black suit, rent by sorrow, at this very hour at which the two ladies sat and talked in the drawing room, was standing by an open grave in the village churchyard, seeing the last of his love, under a pile of blossoms as pink and white as her own complexion, within 4 elm boards, with a brass plate upon the cover. Now, therefore, there was a new situation to face, and Mrs. Baxter was regarding it with apprehension. It is true that mothers know something more of their sons than their sons know of themselves, but there are certain elements of character that sometimes neither mothers nor sons appreciate. It was one or two of those elements that Maggie Deronay, with her hands behind her head, was now considering. It seemed to her very odd that neither the boy himself nor Mrs. Baxter in the least seemed to realize the astonishing selfishness of this very boy's actions. She had known him now for 3 years, though, owing to her own absence in France a part of the time, and his absence in London for the rest, she had seen nothing of this last affair. At first, she had liked him exceedingly. He had seemed to her ardent, natural, and generous. She had liked his affection for his mother, and his demonstrativeness in showing it. She had liked his well-bred swagger, his manner with servants, his impulsive courtesy to herself. It was a real pleasure to her to see him morning by morning in his knickerbockers and Norfolk jacket or his tweed suit, and evening by evening in his swallowtail coat and white shirt, and the knee breeches and buckled shoes that he wore by reason of the touch of picturesque and defiant romanticism that was so obvious a part of his nature. Then she had begun, little by little, to perceive the egotism that was even more apparent, his self-will, his moodiness, and his persistence. Though, naturally, she had approved of his conversion to Catholicism, yet she was not sure that his motives were pure. She had hoped, indeed, that the Church, with its astonishing peremptoriness, might do something towards a moral conversion, as well as an artistic and intellectual change of view. But this, it seemed, had not happened, and this final mad episode of Amy Nugent had fanned her criticism to indignation. She did not disapprove of romance. In fact, she largely lived by it. But there were things even more important, and she was as angry as she could be with decency at this last manifestation of selfishness. For the worst of it was that, as she knew perfectly well, Laurie was rather an exceptional person. He was not at all the young fool of fiction. There was a remarkable virility about him. He was tender-hearted to a degree. He had more than his share of brains. It was intolerable that such a person should be so silly. She wondered what sorrow would do for him. She had come down from Scotland the night before, and down here to Herefordshire this morning. She had not then yet seen him, and he was now at the funeral. Well, sorrow would be his test. How would he take it? Mrs. Baxter broke in on her meditations. Maggie, darling, do you think you can do anything? You know, I once hoped. The girl looked up suddenly, with so vivid an air that it was an interruption. The old lady broke off. Well, well, she said, but it is quite impossible that. Please don't. I can't talk about that. It's impossible. Utterly impossible. The old lady sighed. Then she said suddenly, looking at the clock above the oak mantel-shelf, It is 1/2 past, I expect. She broke off as the front door was heard to open and close beyond the hall, and waited, paling a little, as steps sounded on the flags. But the steps went up the stairs outside, and there was silence again. He's come back, she said. Oh, my dear. How shall you treat him? Asked the girl curiously. The old lady bent again over her embroidery. I think I shall just say nothing. I hope he will ride this afternoon. Will you go with him? I think not. He won't want anyone. I know, Laurie. The other looked up at her sideways in a questioning way, and Maggie went on with a kind of slow decisiveness. He will be queer at lunch. Then he will probably ride alone and be late for tea, and tomorrow... Oh, my dear, Mrs. Stapleton's coming to lunch tomorrow. Do you think he'll mind? Who is Mrs. Stapleton? The old lady hesitated. She's the wife of Colonel Stapleton. She goes in for what I think is called New Thought. At least, so somebody told me last month. I'm afraid she's not a very steady person. She was a vegetarian last year. Now I believe she's given that up again. Maggie smiled slowly, showing a row of very white, strong teeth. I know, Auntie, she said. No, I shouldn't think Laurie'll mind much. Perhaps he'll go back to town in the morning, too. No, my dear, he's staying till Thursday. There fell again one of those pleasant silences that are possible in the country. Outside the garden, with the meadows beyond the village road, lay in the sweet September hush of sunlight and mellow color that seemed to embalm the house in peace. From the farm beyond the stable yard came the crowing of a cock. followed by the liquid chuckle of a pigeon perched somewhere overhead among the twisted chimneys. And within this room all was equally at peace. The sunshine lay on a table and polished floor, barred by the mullions of the windows, and stained here and there by the little Flemish emblems and coats that hung across the glass, while those two figures, so perfectly in place in their serenity and leisure, sat before the open fireplace and contemplated the very unpeaceful element that had just walked upstairs incarnate in a pale, drawn-eyed young man in black. The house, in fact, was one of those that have a personality as marked and as mysterious as of a human character. It affected people in quite an extraordinary way. It took charge of the casual guest, entertained and soothed and sometimes silenced him, and it cast upon all who lived in it an enchantment at once inexplicable and delightful. Externally, it was nothing remarkable. It was a large, square-built house, close indeed to the road, but separated from it by a high wrought-iron gate in an oak paling, and a short, straight garden path, originally even any Tudor, but matured through centuries with a Queen Anne front of mellow red brick, and back premises of tile, oak, and modern rough cast, with old brewhouses that almost enclosed a gravelled court behind. Behind this, again, lay a great kitchen garden with box-lined paths dividing it into a dozen rectangles, separated from the orchard and yew walk by a broad double hedge, down the center of which ran a sheltered path. Round the south of the house, and in the narrow strip westwards, lay broad lawns surrounded by high trees, completely shading it from all view of the houses that formed the tiny hamlet 50 yards away. Within, the house had been modernized almost to a commonplace level. A little hall gave entrance to the drawing-room on the right, where these two women now sat, a large, stately room paneled from floor to ceiling, and to the dining-room on the left, and again through to the back, where a smoking-room, an inner hall, and the big kitchens and back premises concluded the ground floor. The two more stories above consisted, on the first floor, of a row of large rooms, airy, high, and dignified, and in the attics of a series of low-pitched chambers, whitewashed, oak-floored, and dormed-windowed, where one or two of the servants slept in splendid isolation. A little flight of irregular steps leading out of the big room on the first floor, where the housekeeper lived in state, gave access to the further rooms near the kitchen and sculleries. Maggie had fallen in love with the place from the instant that she had entered it. She had been warned in her French convent of the giddy gaieties of the world and its temptations, and yet it seemed to her after a week in her new home that the world was very much maligned. There was here a sense of peace and sheltered security that she had hardly known even at school, and little by little she had settled down here, with the mother and the son, until it had begun to seem to her that days spent in London or in other friends' houses were no better than interruptions and failures compared with the leisurely, tender life of this place, where it was so easy to read and pray and possess her soul in peace. This affair of Laurie's was almost the first reminder of what she had known by heresy. The love and death and pain were the bones on which life was modeled. With a sudden movement, she leaned forward, took up the bellows, and began to blow the smoldering logs into flame. Meanwhile, upstairs on a long couch beside the fire in his big bed-sitting room lay a young man on his face, motionless. A week ago, he had been one of those men who in almost any company appeared easy and satisfactory, and, above all, are satisfactory to themselves. His life was a very pleasant one indeed. He had come down from Oxford just a year ago, and had determined to take things as they came, to foster acquaintanceships, to travel a little with a congenial friend, to stay about in other people's houses, and, in fact, to enjoy himself entirely before settling down to read law. He had done this most successfully, and had crowned all, as has been related, by falling in love on a July evening with one who he was quite certain was the mate designed for him for time and eternity. His life, in fact, up to 3 days ago, had developed along exactly those lines, along which his temperament traveled with the greatest ease. He was the only son of a widow. He had an excellent income, he made friends wherever he went, and he had just secured the most charming rooms close to the temple. He had plenty of brains, an exceedingly warm heart, and had lately embraced a religion that satisfied every instinct of his nature. It was the best of all possible worlds, and fitted him like his own well-cut clothes. It consisted of privileges without responsibilities. And now the crash had come, and all was over. As the gong sounded for luncheon, he turned over and lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. It should have been a very attractive face under other circumstances. Beneath his brown curls, just touched with gold, there looked out a pair of gray eyes, bright a week ago, now dimmed with tears and patched beneath with lines of sorrow. His clean-cut, rather passionate lips were set now, with downturned corners and a line of angry self-control piteous to see, and his clear skin seemed stained and dull. He had never dreamt of such misery in all his days. As he lay now, with lax hands at his side, tightening at times in an agony of remembrance, he was seeing vision after vision, turning now and again to the contemplation of a dark future without life, or love, or hope. Again, he saw Amy, as he had first seen her under the luminous July evening, jeweled overhead with peeping stars, amber to the westwards, where the sun had gone down in glory. She was in her sunbonnet and print dress, stepping towards him across the fresh-scented meadow grass lately shorn of its flowers and growth, looking at him with that curious, odd admiration that delighted him with its flattery. Her face was to the west. The reflected glory lay on it, as delicate as the light on a flower, and her blue eyes regarded him beneath a halo of golden hair. He saw her again, as she had been one moonlit evening, as the two stood together by the sluice of the stream, among the stillness of the woods below the village, with all fairyland about them and in their hearts. She had thrown a wrap about her head, and had stolen down there by devious ways, according to the appointment, meeting him, as arranged, as he came out from dinner with all the glamour of the great house about him, in his evening dress, buckled shoes, and knee breeches all complete. How marvelous she had been then, a sweet nymph of flesh and blood, glorified by the moon to an ethereal delicacy, with the living pallor of sun-kissed skin, her eyes looking at him like stars beneath her shawl. They had said very little. They had stood there at the sluice gate, with his arm about her, and herself willingly nestled against him, trembling now and again, looking out at the sheeny surface of the slow-flowing stream, from which, in the imperceptible night breeze, stole away wraith after wraith of water mist to float and lose themselves in the sleeping woods. Or, once more, clearer than all else, he remembered how he had watched her, himself unseen, delaying the delight of revealing himself, one August morning, scarcely 3 weeks ago, as she had come down the road that ran past the house. Again, in her sunbonnet and print dress, with the dew shining about her on grass and hedge, and the haze of a summer morning veiling the intensity of the blue sky above. He had called her then, gently by name, and she had turned her face to him, alight with love and fear and sudden wonder. He remembered even now, with a reflection of memory that was nearly an illusion, the smell of yew and garden flowers. This, then, had been the dream, and today the awakening and the end. That end was even more terrible than he had conceived possible on that horrible Friday morning last week, when he had opened the telegram from her father. He had never before understood the sordidness of her surroundings, as when, an hour ago, he had stood at the graveside, his eyes wandering from that long elm box with the silver plate and the wreath of flowers, to the mourners on the other side, her father, in his broadcloth, his heavy, smooth face pulled in lines of grotesque sorrow, her mother, with her crimson, tear-stained cheeks, her elaborate black, her intolerable crape, and her jet-hung mantle. Even these people had been seen by him up to then through a haze of love. He had thought them simple, honest folk, creatures of the soil, yet wholesome, natural, and sturdy. And now that the jewel was lost, the setting was worse than empty. There, in the elm box, lay the remnants of the shattered gem. He had seen her in her bed on the Sunday, her fallen face, her sunken eyes, all framed in the detestable whiteness of linen and waxen flowers, yet as pathetic and as appealing as ever, and as necessary to his life. It was then that the supreme fact had first penetrated to his consciousness, that he had lost her, the fact which, driven home by the funeral scene this morning, the rustling crowd come to see the young squire, the elm box, the heap of flowers, had now flung him down on this couch, crushed, broken, and hopeless, like young ivy after a thunderstorm. His moods alternated with the rapidity of flying clouds. At one instant he was furious with pain, at the next broken and lax from the same cause. At one moment he cursed God and desired to die, defiant and raging. At the next he sank down into himself as weak as a tortured child, while tears ran down his cheeks and little moans as of an animal murmured in his throat. God was a hated adversary, a merciless judge, a blind fate. There was no God. He was a fiend. There was nothing anywhere in the whole universe but pain and vanity. Yet, through it all, like a throbbing pedal note, ran his need of this girl. He would do anything, suffer anything, make any sacrifice, momentary or lifelong, If he could but see her again, hold her hand for one instant, look into her eyes mysterious with the secret of death. He had but 3 or 4 words to say to her, just to secure himself that she lived and was still his, and then he would say goodbye to her, content and happy, to wait till death should reunite them. Ah, he asked so little, and God would not give it to him. All, then, was a mockery. It was only this past summer that he had begun to fancy himself in love with Maggie Derenay. It had been an emotion of very quiet growth, developing gently week by week, feeding on her wholesomeness, her serenity, her quiet power, her cool, capable hands, and the look in her direct eyes. It resembled respect rather than passion, and need rather than desire. It was a hunger rather than a thirst. Then had risen up this other, blinding and bewildering, and, he told himself, he now knew the difference. His lips curled into bitter and resentful lines as he contemplated the contrast, and all was gone, shattered and vanished, and even Maggie was now impossible. Again he writhed over, sick with pain and longing, and so lay. It was 10 minutes before he moved again, and then he only roused himself as he heard a foot on the stairs. Perhaps it was his mother. He slipped off the couch and stood up. His face lined and creased with the pressure with which he had lain just now, and smoothed his tumbled clothes. Yes, he must go down. He stepped to the door and opened it. "I am coming immediately," he said to the servant. He bore himself at lunch with a respectable self-control, though he said little or nothing. His mother's attitude he found hard to bear, as he caught her eyes once or twice looking at him with sympathy, and he allowed himself internally to turn to Maggie with relief in spite of his meditations just now. She at least respected his sorrow, he told himself. She bore herself very naturally, though with long silences, and never once met his eyes with her own. He made his excuses as soon as he could, and slipped across to the stable yard. At least he would be alone this afternoon. Only, as he rode away half an hour later, he caught a sight of the slender little figure of his mother, waiting to have one word with him if she could, beyond the hall door. But he set his lips, and would not see her. It was one of those perfect September days that fell sometimes as a gift from heaven after the bargain of summer has been more or less concluded. As he rode all that afternoon through lanes and across uplands, his view barred always to the north by the great downs above Royston, grey-blue against the radiant sky, there was scarcely a hint in earth or heaven of any emotion except prevailing peace. Yet the very serenity tortured him the more by its mockery. The birds babbled in the deep woods, the cheerful noise of children reached him now and again from his cottage garden, the mellow light smiled unending benediction, and yet his subconsciousness let go for never an instant of the long elm box 6 feet below the ground, and of its contents, laying there, in the stifling dark, in the long grass churchyard, on the hill above his home. He wondered now and again as to the fate of the spirit that had informed the body and made it what it was, but his imagination refused to work. After all, he asked himself, what were all the teachings of theology but words gabbled to break the appalling silence? Heaven, purgatory, hell, what was known of these things? The very soul itself, what was that? What was the inconceivable environment, after all, for so inconceivable a thing? He did not need these things, he said, certainly not now, nor those labels and signposts to a doubtful, unimaginable land. He needed Amy herself, or at least some hint or sound or glimpse to show him that she indeed was as she had always been, whether in earth or heaven, he did not care. That there was somewhere, something that was herself, some definite personal being of a continuous consciousness with that which he had known, characterized still by those graces which he thought he had recognized and certainly loved. He did not ask much. It would be so easy to God. Here, out in this lonely lane where he rode beneath the branches, his reins loose on his horse's neck, his eyes, unseeing, roving over copse and meadow across to the eternal hills, a face, seen for an instant, smiling and gone again, a whisper in his ear with that dear stammer of shyness, a touch on his knee of those rippling fingers that he had watched in the moonlight playing gently on the sluice gate above the moonlit stream. He would tell no one if God wished it to be a secret. He would keep it wholly to himself. He did not ask now to possess her, only to be certain that she lived, and that death was not what it seemed to be. "Is Father Mahan home?" he asked as he halted a mile from his own house in the village, where stood the little tin church, not 100 yards from its elder, alienated sister, to which he and Maggie went on Sundays. The housekeeper turned from her vegetable gathering beyond the fence and told him yes. He dismounted, hitched the reins round the gate-post, and went in. Ah, what an antipathetic little room this was in which he waited while the priest was being fetched from upstairs. Over the mantelpiece hung a large oleograph of Leo XIII in cope and tiara, blessing with unpraised hand and that eternal, wide-lipped smile. A couple of jars stood beneath, filled with dyed grasses. A briar pipe, redolent and foul, lay between them. The rest of the room was in the same key. A bright Brussels carpet, pale and worn by the door, covered the floor. Cheap lace curtains were pinned across the windows, and over the littered table a painted deal bookshelf held a dozen volumes, devotional, moral, and dogmatic theology, and by the side of that an illuminated address framed in gilt, and so on. Laurie looked at it all in dumb dismay. He had seen it before again and again, but he had never realized its horror as he realized it now from the depths of his own misery. Was it really true that his religion could emit such results? There was a step on the stairs, a very heavy one, and Father Mahan came in, a large, crimson-faced man, who seemed to fill the room with a completely unethereal presence, and held out his hand with certain gravity. Laurie took it and dropped it. "Sit down, my dear boy," said the priest, and he impelled him gently to a horsehair-covered armchair. Laurie stiffened. "Thank you, Father, but I mustn't stay." He fumbled in his pocket and fetched out a little paper-covered packet. "Will you say Mass for my intention, please?" And he laid the packet on the mantel-shelf. The priest took up the coins and slipped them into his waistcoat pocket. "Certainly," he said. "I think I know." Laurie turned away with a little jerk. "I must be going," he said. I only looked in. "Mr. Baxter," said the other, "I hope you will allow me to say how much—" Laurie drew his breath swiftly with a hiss of pain and glanced at the priest. "You understand, then, what my intention is?" "Why, surely. It is for her soul, is it not?" "I suppose so," said the boy, and went out. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. 1. "I have told him," said Mrs. Baxter as the two women walked beneath the yews that morning after breakfast. "He said he didn't mind." Maggie did not speak. She had come out just as she was, hatless, but had caught up a spud that stood in the hall, and at that instant had stopped to destroy a youthful plantain that had established itself with infinite pains on the slope of the path. She attacked for a few seconds, extricated what was possible of the root with her strong fingers, tossed the corpse among the ivy, and then moved on. "I don't know whether to say anything to Mrs. Stapleton or not," pursued the old lady. "I think I shouldn't, Auntie," said the girl slowly. They spoke of it for a minute or two as they passed up and down, but Maggie only attended with one superficies of her mind. She had gone up as usual to Mass that morning, and had been astonished to find Laurie already in church. They had walked back together, and, to her surprise, he had told her that the Mass had been for his own intention. She had answered as well as she could, but a sentence or two of his as they came near home had vaguely troubled her. It was not that he had said anything he ought not, as a Catholic, to have said, yet her instinct told her that something was wrong. It was his manner, his air that troubled her. What strange people these converts were. There was so much ardor at one time, so much chilliness at another. There was so little of that steady workaday acceptance of religious facts that marked the born Catholic. "Mrs. Stapleton is a new thought kind of person," she said presently. "So I understand," said the old lady with a touch of peevishness. "A vegetarian last year, and I believe she was a sort of Buddhist 5 or 6 years ago, and then she nearly became a Christian Scientist a little while ago." Maggie smiled. "I wonder what she'll talk about," she said. "I hope she won't be very advanced," went on the old lady. "And you think I'd better not tell her about Laurie?" "I'm sure it's best not," said the girl. "Or she'll tell him about deep breathing or saying Om or something. No, I should let Laurie alone." It was a little before 1 o'clock that the motor arrived, and that there descended from it at the iron gate a tall, slender woman, hooded and veiled, who walked up the little path, observed by Maggie from her bedroom, with a kind of whisking step. The motor moved on, wheeled in through the gates at the left, and sank into silence in the stable-yard. "It's too charming of you, dear Mrs. Baxter," Maggie heard as she came into the drawing-room a minute or two later, "to let me come over like this. I've heard so much about this house. Lady Laura was telling me how very psychical it all was. My adopted daughter, Miss Derenay, observed the old lady. Maggie saw a rather pretty, passé face, triangular in shape with small red lips looking at her as she made her greetings. Ah, how perfect all this is, went on the guest presently, looking about her. How suggestive, how full of meaning. She threw back her cloak presently, and Maggie observed that she was busy with various very beautiful little emblems, a scarab, a snake swallowing its tail, and so forth, all exquisitely made and hung upon a slender chain of some green enamel-like material. Certainly she was true to type. As the full light fell upon her, it became plain that this otherworldly soul did not disdain to use certain toilet requisites upon her face, and a curious Eastern odor exhaled from her dress. Fortunately, Maggie had a very deep sense of humor, and she hardly resented all this at all, nor even the tactful hints dropped from time to time, after the conventional part of the conversation was over, to the effect that Christianity was, of course, played out, and that a higher light had dawned. Mrs. Stapleton did not quite say this outright, but it amounted to as much. Even before Laurie came downstairs, it appeared that the lady did not go to church, yet that such was her broad-mindedness, she did not at all object to do so. It was all one, it seemed, in the deeper unity. Nothing particular was true, but it was all very suggestive and significant and symbolic of something else to which Mrs. Stapleton and few friends had the key. Mrs. Baxter made more than one attempt to get back to more mundane subjects, but it was useless. When even the weather serves as a symbol, the plain man is done for. Then Laurie came in. He looked very self-contained and rather pinched this morning, and shook hands with the lady without a word. Then they moved across presently to the green-hung dining room across the hall, and the exquisite symbol of luncheon made its appearance. Lady Laura, it appeared, was one of those who had felt the charm of the Stantons. Only for her it was psychical rather than physical, and all this was passed on by her friend. It seemed that the psychical atmosphere of most modern houses was of a very yellow tint, but that this one emanated a brown-gold radiance which was very peculiar and exceptional. Indeed, it was this singularity that had caused Mrs. Stapleton to apply for an invitation to the house. More than once during lunch, in a pause of the conversation, Maggie saw her throw back her head slightly, as if to appreciate some odor or color not experienced by coarser-nerved persons. Once, indeed, she actually put this into words. "Dear Laura was quite right," cried the lady. "There is something very unique about this place. How fortunate you are, dear Mrs. Baxter." "My dear husband's grandfather bought the place," observed the mistress plaintively. "We have always found it very soothing and pleasant." "How right you are! And have you had any experiences here?" Mrs. Baxter eyed her in alarm. Maggie had an irrepressible burst of internal laughter, which, however, gave no hint of its presence in her steady features. She glanced at Laurie, who was eating mutton with a depressed air. "I was talking to Mr. Vincent, the great spiritualist," went on the other vivaciously, "only last week. You've heard of him, Mrs. Baxter? I was suggesting to him that any place where great emotions have been felt is colored and stained by them as objectively as old walls are weathered and beaten. I had such an interesting conversation, too, with Cardinal Newman on the subject." She smiled brilliantly at Maggie, as if to reassure her of her own orthodoxy. "Scarcely 6 weeks ago." There was a pregnant silence. Mrs. Baxter's fork sank to her plate. "I don't understand," she said faintly. "Cardinal Newman, surely." "Why, yes," said the other gently. "I know it sounds very startling to orthodox ears, but to us of the higher thought, all these things are quite familiar. Of course, I need hardly to say that Cardinal Newman is no longer, but perhaps I had better not go on." She glanced archly at Maggie. "Oh, please go on," said Maggie genially. "You were saying that Cardinal Newman—" "Dear Miss Derenay, are you sure you will not be offended? I'm always glad to receive new light," said Maggie solemnly. The other looked at her doubtfully, but there was no hint of irony in the girl's face. "Well," she began, "of course, on the other side, they see things very differently. I don't mean at all that any religion is exactly untrue. Oh, no, they tell us that if we cannot welcome the new light, then the old lights will do very well for the present. Indeed, when there are Catholics present, Cardinal Newman does not scruple to give them a Latin blessing." "Is it true that he speaks with an American accent?" asked Maggie gravely. The other laughed with a somewhat shrill geniality. "That is too bad, Miss Derenay. Well, of course, the personality of the medium affects the vehicle through which the communications come. That is no difficulty at all when once you understand the principle. Mrs. Baxter interrupted. She could bear it no longer. Mrs. Stapleton, do you mean that Cardinal Newman really speaks to you? Why, yes, said the other with a patient indulgence. That is a very usual experience, but Mr. Vincent does much more than that. It is quite a common experience not to only hear him, but to see him. I've shaken hands with him more than once, and I have seen a Catholic kiss his ring. Mrs. Baxter looked helplessly at the girl, and Maggie came to the rescue once more. This sounds rather advanced to us, she said. Won't you explain the principles first? Mrs. Stapleton laid her knife and fork down, leaned back, and began to discourse. When a little later her plate was removed, she refused sweets with a gesture and continued. Although she spoke for about 10 minutes uninterrupted, enjoying herself enormously, the others ate food or refused it in attentive silence. Then at last she ended. I know all this must sound quite mad and fanatical to those who have not experienced it, and yet to us who have been disciples, it is as natural to meet our friends who have crossed over as to meet those who have not. Dear Miss Baxter, think how all of this enlarges life. There's no longer any death to those who understand. All those limitations are removed. It's no more than going into another room. All are together in the hands of the All-Father. Maggie recognized the jetsam of Christian Science. O death, as Paul says, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Mrs. Stapleton flashed a radiant look of helplessness round the faces, lingering for an instant on Laurie's, and leaned back. There followed a silence. Shall we go into the drawing-room? Suggested Mrs. Baxter, feebly rising. The guest rose too, again, with a brilliant, patient smile, and swept out. Maggie crossed herself and looked at Laurie. The boy had an expression, half of disgust, half of interest, and his eyelids sank a little and rose again. Then Maggie went out after the others. 2. A dreadful woman, observed Mrs. Baxter half an hour later, as the two strolled back up the garden path, after seeing Mrs. Stapleton wave a delicately gloved hand encouragingly to them over the back of the throbbing motor. I suppose she thinks she believes it all, said Maggie. My dear, that woman would believe anything. I hope poor Laurie was not too much distressed. Oh, I think Laurie took it all right. It was most unfortunate, all that about death and the rest. Why, here comes Laurie. I thought he would be gone out by now. The boy strolled towards them round the corner of the house, tossing away the fragment of his cigarette. He was still in his dark suit, bareheaded, with no signs of writing about him. So you've not gone out yet, dear boy, remarked his mother. Not yet, he said, and hesitated as they went on. Mrs. Baxter noticed it. I'll go and get ready, she said. The carriage will be round at 3, Maggie. When she was gone, the two moved out together onto the lawn. What did you think of that woman? Demanded Laurie with a detached air. Maggie glanced at him. His tone was a little too much detached. I thought her quite dreadful, she said frankly. Didn't you? She added. Oh, yes, I suppose so, said Laurie. He drew out a cigarette and lighted it. You know, a lot of people think there's something in it, he said. In what? Spiritualism. I dare say, said Maggie. She perceived out of the corner of her eye that Laurie looked at her suddenly and sharply. For herself, she loathed what little she knew of the subject so cordially and completely that she could hardly have put it into words. 9/10 of it she believed to be fraud, a matter of wigs and Indian muslins and cross lights, and the other 10th, by the most generous estimate, an affair of the dingiest and foulest of all the backstairs of life. The prophetic outpourings of Mrs. Stapleton had not altered her opinion. Oh, well, if you feel like that, went on Laurie. She turned on him. Laurie, she said, I think it perfectly detestable. I acknowledge I don't know much about it, but what little I do know is enough, thank you. Laurie smiled in a faintly patronizing way. Well, he said indulgently, if you think that, it's not much use discussing it. Indeed it's not, said Maggie with her nose in the air. There was not much more to be said, and the sounds of stamping and woeing in the stable yard presently sent the girl indoors in a hurry. Mrs. Baxter was still mildly querulous during the drive. It appeared to her, Maggie perceived, a kind of veiled insult that things should be talked about in her house which did not seem to fit in with her own scheme of the universe. Mrs. Baxter knew perfectly well that every soul when it left this world went either to what she called paradise, or in extreme exceptional cases, to the place she did not name, and that these places, each in its own way, entirely absorbed the attention of its inhabitants. Further, it was established in her view that all the members of the spiritual world, apart from the unhappy ones, were a kind of Anglicans, with their minds no doubt enlarged considerably, but on the original lines. Tales like this of Cardinal Newman, therefore, were extremely tiresome and upsetting. And Maggie had her theology also. To her, also, it appeared quite impossible that Cardinal Newman should frequent the drawing room of Mr. Vincent in order to exchange impressions with Mrs. Stapleton. But she was more elementary in her answer. For her, the thing was simply untrue, and that was the end of it. She found it difficult, therefore, to follow her companion's train of thought. "What was it she said?" demanded Mrs. Baxter presently. "I didn't understand her ideas about materialism." "I think she called it materialization," explained Maggie patiently. "She said that when things were very favorable, and the medium a very good one, the soul that wanted to communicate could make a kind of body for itself out of what she called the astral matter of the medium or the sitters. But surely our bodies aren't like that." "No, I can't say that I think they are, but that's what she said." "My dear, please explain. I want to understand the woman." Maggie frowned a little. "Well, the first thing she said was that souls want to communicate, and that they begin generally by things like table rapping or making blue lights. Then, when you know they're there, they can go further. Sometimes they gain control of the medium, who is in a trance, and speak through him or write with his hand. Then, if things are favorable, they begin to draw out this matter and make it into kind of body for themselves, very thin and ethereal, so that you can pass your hand through it. Then, as things get better and better, they go further still and can make this body so solid that you can touch it. Only this is sometimes rather dangerous, as it is still, in a sort of way, connected with the medium. I think that's the idea." "But what's the good of it all?" "Well, you see, Mrs. Stapleton thinks that they really are souls from the other world, and that they can tell us all kinds of things about it all, and what's true, and so on." "But you don't believe that?" Maggie turned her large eyes on the old lady, and a spark of humor rose and glimmered in them. "Of course I don't," she said. "Then how do you explain it?" "I think it's probably all fraud, but I really don't know. It doesn't seem to me to matter much. But if it should be true—" Maggie raised her eyebrows, smiling. "Dear auntie, do put it out of your head. How could it possibly be true?" Mrs. Baxter set her lips in as much severity as she could. "I shall ask the vicar," she said. "We might stop at the vicarage on the way back." Mrs. Baxter did not often stop at the vicarage, as she did not altogether approve of the vicar's wife. There was a good deal of pride in the old lady, and it seemed to her occasionally as if Mrs. Rymer did not understand the difference between the hall and the parsonage. She envied sometimes, secretly, the Romanist idea of celibacy. It was so much easier to get on with your spiritual adviser if you did not have to consider his wife. But here was a matter which the clergyman must settle for her once and for all. So she put on a slight air of dignity, which became her very well, and a little after 4 o'clock, the Victoria turned up the steep little drive that led to the vicarage. 3. The dusk was already fallen before Laurie, strolling vaguely in the garden, heard the carriage wheels draw up at the gate outside. He had ridden again alone, and his mind had run, to a certain extent, as might be expected, upon the recent guest and her very startling conversation. He was an intelligent young man, and he had not been in the least taken by her pseudo-mystical remarks. Yet there had been something in her extreme assurance that had affected him, as a man may smile sourly at a good story in bad taste. His attitude, in fact, was that of most Christians under the circumstances. He did not, for an instant, believe that such things really and literally happened, and yet it was difficult to advance any absolutely conclusive argument against them. Merely, they had not come his way. They appeared to conflict with experience, and they usually found as their advocates such persons as Mrs. Stapleton. Two things, however, prevailed to keep the matter before his mind. The first was his own sense of loss, his own experience, sore and hot within him, of the unapproachable emptiness of death. The second, Maggie's attitude. When a plainly sensible and controlled young woman takes up a position of superiority, she is apt, unless the young man in her company happens to be in love with her, and sometimes even when he is, to provoke and irritate him into a camp of opposition. She is still more apt to do so if her relations to him have once been in the line of even greater tenderness. Laurie, then, was not in the most favorable of moods to receive the dicta of the vicar. They were announced to him immediately after Mrs. Baxter had received from Maggie's hands her first cup of tea. "Mr. Rymer tells me it's all nonsense," she said. Laurie looked up. "What?" he said. "Mr. Rymer tells me spiritualism is all nonsense. He told me about someone called Eglingham who kept a beard in his portmanteau." "Eglinton, I think, Auntie," put in Maggie. "I dare say, my dear. Anyhow, it's all the same. I felt sure it must be so." Laurie took a bun with a thoughtful air. "Does Mr. Rymer know very much about it, do you think, Mother?" "Dear boy, I think he knows all that anyone need know. Besides, if you come to think of it, how could Cardinal Newman possibly appear in a drawing-room, particularly when Mrs. Stapleton says he isn't a Christian any longer?" This had been a possible and rather pleasing double interpretation, but Laurie decided it was not worth while to be humorous. "What about the Witch of Endor?" he asked innocently instead. "That was in the Old Testament," answered his mother rapidly. "Mr. Rymer said something about that, too." "Oh, wasn't it really Samuel who appeared?" "Mr. Rymer thinks that things were permitted then that are not permitted now." Laurie drank up his cup of tea. It is a humiliating fact that extreme grief often renders the mourner rather cross. There was a distant air of crossness about Laurie at this moment. His nerves were very near the top. "Well, that's very convenient," he said. "Maggie, do you know if there's any book on spiritualism in the house?" The girl glanced uneasily near the fireplace. "I don't know," she said. "Yes, I think there's something up there. I believe I saw it the other day." Laurie rose and stood opposite the shelves. "What color is it? No more tea, thanks." Black and red, I think," said the girl. "I forget." She looked up at him, faintly uneasy, as he very deliberately drew down a book from the shelf and turned the pages. "Yes, this is it," he said. "Thanks very much. No, really, no more tea. Thanks, Mother." Then he went to the door with his easy, rather long steps and disappeared. They heard his steps in the inner hall, then a door closed overhead. Mrs. Baxter contentedly poured herself out another cup of tea. "Poor boy," she said. "He's thinking of that girl still. I'm glad he's got something to occupy his mind." The end room on the first floor was Laurie's possession. It was a big place with 2 windows and a large open fire, and he had skillfully masked the fact that it was a bedroom by disposing his furniture, with the help of a screen, in such a manner as completely to hide the bed and washing arrangements. The rest of the room he had furnished in a pleasing male kind of fashion, with a big couch drawn across the fire, a writing table and chairs, a deep easy chair near the door, and a long, high bookcase covering the wall between the door and the windows. His college ore, too, hung here, and there were pleasant groups and pictures scattered on the other walls. Maggie did not often come in here, except by invitation, but about 7 o'clock on this evening, half an hour before she had to go and dress, she thought she would look in on him for a few minutes. She was still a little uncomfortable. She did not quite know why. It was too ridiculous, she told herself, that a sensible boy like Laurie could be seriously affected by what she considered the wicked nonsense of spiritualism. Yet she went, telling herself that Laurie's grief was an excuse for showing him a little marked friendliness. Besides, she would like to ask him whether he was really going back to town on Thursday. She tapped twice before an answer came, and then it seemed a rather breathless voice which spoke. The boy was sitting bolt upright on the edge of the sofa, with a couple of candles at his side and the book in his hands. There was a strained and intensely interested look in his eyes. "May I come in for a few minutes? It's nearly dressing time," she said. "Oh, certainly." He got up rather stiffly, still keeping his place in the book with one finger while she sat down. Then he, too, sat again, and there was silence for a moment. "Why, you're not smoking," she said. "I forgot. I will now, if you don't mind." She saw his fingers tremble a little as he put out his hand to a box of cigarettes at his side, but he put the book down after looking at the page. She could keep her question in no longer. "What do you think of that?" she said, nodding at the book. He filled his lungs with smoke and exhaled slowly. "I think it's extraordinary," he said shortly. "In what way?" Again he paused before answering. Then he answered deliberately. "If human evidence is worth anything, Those things happen, he said. What things? The dead return. Maggie looked at him, aware of his deliberate attempt at dramatic brevity. He was watching the end of his cigarette with elaborate attention, and his face had that white, rather determined look that she had seen on it once or twice before in the presence of a domestic crisis. Do you really mean you believe that? She said with a touch of careful bitterness in her voice. I do, he said. Or else. Well, or else human evidence is worth nothing at all. Maggie understood him perfectly, but she realized that this was not an occasion to force issues. She still put the tone of faint irony into her voice. You really believe that Cardinal Newman comes to Mr. Vincent's drawing room and raps on tables? I really believe that it's possible to get in touch with those whom we call dead. Each instance, of course, depends on its own evidence. And Cardinal Newman? I have not studied the evidence for Cardinal Newman, remarked Laurie in a head voice. Let's have a look at that book, said Maggie impulsively. He handed it to her, and she began to turn the pages, pausing now and again to read a particular paragraph, and once for nearly a minute while she examined an illustration. Certainly, the book seemed interestingly written, and she read an argument or two that appeared reasonably presented. Yet she was extraordinarily repelled even by the dead paper and the ink she had in her hands. It was as if it was something obscene. Finally, she tossed it back on the couch. Laurie waited, but she said nothing. Well? He asked at last, still refraining from looking at her. I think it's horrible, she said. Laurie delicately adjusted a little tobacco protruding from his cigarette. Isn't that a little unreasonable? He asked. You've hardly looked at it yet. Maggie knew this mood of his only too well. He reserved it for occasions when he was determined to fight. Argument was a useless weapon against it. My dear boy, she said with an effort. I'm sorry. I dare say it is unreasonable, but that kind of thing does seem to me so disgusting. That's all. I didn't come to talk about that. Tell me. Didn't you? Said Laurie. Maggie was silent. Didn't you? Well, yes, I did. But I don't want to anymore. Laurie smiled so that it might be seen. Well, what else did you want to say? He glanced purposely at the book. Maggie ignored his glance. I just came to see how you were getting on. How do you mean? With the book? No, in every way. He looked up at her, swiftly and suddenly, and she saw that his agony of sorrow was acute beneath all his attempts at superiority, his courteous fractiousness, and his set face. She was filled suddenly with an enormous pity. Oh, Laurie, I'm so sorry, she cried out. Can't I do anything? Nothing, thanks. Nothing at all, he said quietly. Again, pity and misery surged up within her, and she cast all prudence to the winds. She had not realized how fond she was of this boy till she saw once more that look in his eyes. Oh, Laurie, you know I didn't like it, but I don't know what to do. I'm so sorry. But don't spoil it all, she said wildly, hardly knowing what she feared. I beg your pardon? You know what I mean. Don't spoil it by fancying things. Maggie, said the boy quietly, you must let me alone. You can't help. Can't I? You can't help, he repeated. I must go my own way. Please don't say any more. I can't stand it. There followed a dead silence. Then Maggie recovered and stood up. He rose with her. Forgive me, Laurie, won't you? I must say this. You'll remember I'll always do anything I can, won't you? Then she was gone. 4. The ladies went to bed early at Stanton's. At 10 o'clock precisely, a clinking of bedroom candlesticks was heard in the hall, followed by the sound of locking doors. This was the signal. Mrs. Baxter laid aside her embroidery with the punctuality of a religious at the sound of a bell, and said 2 words, My dears. There were occasionally exclamatory expostulations from the 2 at the piquet table, but in 9 cases out of 10 the game had been designed with an eye upon the clock, and hardly any delay followed. Mrs. Baxter kissed her son and passed an arm through Maggie's. Laurie followed, gave them candles, and generally took one himself. But this evening there was no piquet. Laurie had stayed later than usual in the dining room, and had wandered rather restlessly about when he had joined the others. He looked at a London evening paper for a little, paced about, vanished again, and only returned as the ladies were making ready to depart. Then he gave them their candlesticks, and himself came back to the drawing-room. He was, in fact, in a far more perturbed and excited mood than even Maggie had had any idea of. She had interrupted him halfway through the book, but he had read again steadily until 5 minutes before dinner, and had, indeed, gone back again to finish it afterwards. He had now finished it, and he wanted to think. It had had a surprising effect on him, coming as it did upon a state of mind intensely stirred to its depths by his sorrow. Crossness, as I have said, had been the natural psychological result of his emotions, but his emotions were none the less real. The froth of whipped cream is real cream, after all. Now, Laurie had seen perfectly well the extreme unconvincingness of Mrs. Stapleton, and had been genuine enough in his little shrug of disapproval in answer to Maggie's after lunch. Yet that lady's remarks had been sufficient just to ignite the train of thought. This train had smoldered in the afternoon, had been fanned ever so slightly by 2 breezes, the sense of Maggie's superiority, and the faint, rebellious reaction which had come upon him with regard to his personal religion. Certainly he had had Mass said for Amy this morning, but it had been by almost a superstitious rather than a religious instinct. He was, in fact, in that state of religious unreality which occasionally comes upon converts within a year or two of the change of their faith. The impetus of old association is absent, and the force of novelty has died. Underneath all this, then, it must be remembered that the one thing that was intensely real to him was his sense of loss of the one soul in whom his own had been wrapped up. Even this afternoon as yesterday, even this morning as he lay awake, he had been conscious of an irresistible impulse to demand some sign, to catch some glimpse of that which was now denied to him. It was in this mood that he had read the book, and it is not to be wondered at that he had been excited by it, for it opened up to him, beneath all its sham mysticism, its intolerable affectations, its grotesque parody of spirituality, of all of which was largely aware, a glimmering avenue of a faintly possible hope of which he had never dreamed. A hope, at least, of that half self-deception which is so tempting to certain characters. Here, in this book, written by a living man, whose name and address were given, were stories so startling, and theories so apparently consonant with themselves and with other partly known facts, stories and theories, too, which met so precisely his own overmastering desire, that it is little wonder that he was affected by them. Naturally, even during his reading, 1,000 answers and adverse comments had sprung to his mind, suggestions of fraud, of lying, of hallucination, but yet, here the possibility remained. Here were living men and women who, with the usual complement of senses and reason, declared categorically and in detail that on this and that date, in this place and the other, after having taken all possible precautions against fraud, they had received messages from the dead, messages of which the purport was understood by none but themselves, that they had seen with their eyes, in sufficient light, the actual features of the dead whom they loved, that they had even clasped their hands, and held for an instant the bodies of those whom they had seen die with their own eyes, and buried. When the lady's footsteps had ceased to sound overhead, Laurie went to the French window, opened it, and passed on to the lawn. He was astonished at the warmth of the September night. The little wind that had been chilly this afternoon had dropped with the coming of the dark, and high overhead he could see the great masses of the leaves motionless against the sky. He passed around the house and beneath the yews, and sat down on the garden bench. It was darker here than outside on the lawn. Beneath his feet were the soft needles from the trees, and above him, as he looked out, still sunk in his thought, he could see the glimmer of a star or two between the branches. It was a fragrant, kindly night. From the hamlet of 6 houses beyond the garden came no sound, and the house, too, was still behind him. An illuminated window somewhere on the first floor went out as he looked at it, like a soul leaving a body. Once a sleepy bird somewhere in the shrubbery chirped to its mate and was silent again. Then, as he still labored in argument, putting this against that and weighing that against the other, his emotion rose up in an irresistible torrent, and all consideration ceased. One thing remained. He must have Amy, or he must die. It was 5 or 6 minutes before he moved again from that attitude of clenched hands and tensely strung muscles into which his sudden passion had cast him. During those minutes he had willed with his whole power that she should come to him now and here, down in this warm and fragrant darkness, hidden from all eyes, in this sweet silence, round which sleep kept its guard. Such things had happened before. Such things must have happened, for the will and the love of man are the mightiest forces in creation. Surely again and again it had happened. There must be somewhere in the world man after man who had so called back the dead, a husband sobbing silently in the dark, a child wailing for his mother. Surely that force had before, in the world's history, willed back again from the mysterious dark of space the dear personality that was all that even heaven could give, had even compelled into a semblance of life some sort of body to clothe it. These things must have happened, only secrets had been well kept. So this boy had willed it, yet the dark had remained empty, and no shadow, no faintly outlined face, had even for an instant blotted out the star on which he stared. No touch on his shoulder, no whisper in his ear. It had seemed, as he strove there, in the silence, that it must be done, that there was no limit to power concentrated and intense. Yet it had not happened. Once he had shuddered a little, and the very shudder of fear had had in it a touch of delicious, trembling expectation. Yet it had not happened. Laurie relaxed his muscles, therefore, let his breath exhale in a long sigh, and once more remembered the book he had read and Mrs. Stapleton's feverish, self-conscious thought. Half an hour later his mother, listening in her bed, heard his footsteps pass her room. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. 1. Lady Laura Bethel, spinster, had just returned to her house in Queensgate with her dearest friend Mrs. Stapleton for a few days of psychical orgy. It was in her house, as much as in any in London, that the modern prophets were to be met with severe-looking women in shapeless dresses, little men and big, with long hair and cloaks, and it was in her drawing-room that tea and queen cakes were dispensed to inquirers, and papers read and discussed when the revels were over. Lady Laura herself was not yet completely emancipated from what her friends sometimes called the grave clothes of the so-called revelation. To her it seemed a profound truth that things could be true and untrue simultaneously, that what might be facts on this side, as she would have expressed it, might be falsehoods on the other. She was accustomed, therefore, to attend All Saints, Carlton Gardens in the morning, and psychical drawing-rooms or halls in the evening, and to declare to her friends how beautifully the one aspect illuminated and interpreted the other. For the rest, she was a small, fair-haired woman, with penciled dark eyebrows, a small aquiline nose, gold pince-nez, and an exquisite taste in dress. The two were seated this Tuesday evening, a week after Mrs. Stapleton's visit to the Stantons, in the drawing-room of the Queensgate house, over the remnants of what corresponded to 5 o'clock tea. I say corresponded, since both of them were sufficiently advanced to have renounced actual tea altogether. Mrs. Stapleton partook of a little hot water out of a copper-jacketed jug, her hostess of boiled milk. They shared their plasmon biscuits together. These things were considered important for those who would successfully find the higher light. At this instant they were discussing Mr. Vincent. "Dearest, he seems to me so different from the others," mewed Lady Laura. "He is such a man, you know. So often those others are not quite like men at all. They wear such funny clothes, and their hair always so queer somehow." "Darling, I know what you mean. Yes, there's a great deal about that James Vincent. Even dear Tom was almost polite to him. He couldn't bear the others. He said that he always thought they were going to paw him. And then his powers," continued Lady Laura. "His powers always seem to me so much greater. The magnetism is so much more evident." Mrs. Stapleton finished her hot water. "We are going on Sunday?" she said questioningly. "Yes, just a small party, and he comes here tomorrow, you remember, just for a talk. I have asked a clergyman I know in to meet him. It seems to me such a pity that our religious teachers should know so little of what is going on." "Who is he?" "Oh, Mr. Jameson." Just a young clergyman I met in the summer. I promised to let him know the next time Mr. Vincent came to me." Mrs. Stapleton murmured her gratification. These two had really a great deal in common besides their faith. It is true that Mrs. Stapleton was 40 and her friend but 31, but the former did all that was possible to compensate for this by adroit toilet tactics. Both, too, were accustomed to dress in soft materials, with long chains bearing various emblems. They did their hair in the same way. They cultivated the same kinds of tones in their voices, a purring, mewing manner, suggestive of intuitive kittens. Both alike had a passion for proselytism, but after that, the differences began. There was a deal more in Mrs. Stapleton besides the kittenish qualities. She was perfectly capable of delivering a speech in public. She had written some really well expressed articles in various higher periodicals, and she had a willpower beyond the ordinary. At the point where Lady Laura began to deprecate and soothe, Mrs. Stapleton began to clear decks for action, so to speak, to be incisive, to be fervent, even to be rather eloquent. She kept dear Tom, the colonel, not crushed or beaten, for that was beyond the power of a man to do, but at least silently acquiescent in her program. He allowed her even to entertain her prophetical friends at his expense now and then, and, even when among men, refrained from too bitter speech. It was said by the colonel's friends that Mrs. Colonel had a tongue of her own. Certainly she ruled her house well and did her duty, and it was only because of her husband's absence in Scotland that during this time she was permitting herself the refreshment of a week or two among the illuminated. At about 6 o'clock, Lady Laura announced her intention of retiring for her evening meditation. Opening out of her bedroom was a small dressing room that she had fitted up for this purpose with all the broad suggestiveness that marks the higher thought, decked with ornaments emblematical of at least 3 religions, and provided with a falsehood and an exceedingly easy chair. It was here that she was accustomed to spend an hour before dinner with eyes closed, emancipating herself from all the fetters of sense, and rising to a due appreciation of that nothingness that was all, from which all came, and to which it retired. "I must go, dearest. It is time." A ring at the bell below made her pause. "Do you think that can be Mr. Vincent?" she said, pleasantly apprehensive. "It's not the right day, but one never knows." A footman's figure entered. "Mr. Baxter, my lady. Is your ladyship at home?" "Mr. Baxter?" Mrs. Stapleton rose. "Let me see him instead, dearest. You remember, from Stanton's." "I wonder what he wants," murmured the hostess. "Yes, do see him, Maud. You can always fetch me if it's anything." Then she was gone. Mrs. Stapleton sank into a chair again, and in a minute Laurie was shaking hands with her. Mrs. Stapleton was accustomed to deal with young men, and through long habit had learned how to flatter them without appearing to do so. Laurie's type, however, was less familiar to her. She preferred the kind that grow their hair rather long and wear turned-down collars, and have just found out the hopeless banality of all orthodoxy whatever. She even bore with them when they called themselves unmoral. But she remembered Laurie, the silent boy at lunch last week. She had even mentioned him to Lady Laura, and received information about the village girl, more or less correct. She was also aware that he was a Catholic. She gave him her hand without rising. "Lady Laura asked me to excuse her absence to you, Mr. Baxter. To be quite truthful, she is at home, but had just gone upstairs for her meditation." "Indeed?" "Yes. You know, we think that so important, just as you do. Do sit down, Mr. Baxter. You have had tea?" "Yes, thanks." "I hope she will be down before you go. I don't think she'll be very long this evening. Can I give her any message, Mr. Baxter, in case you don't see her?" Laurie put his hat and stick down carefully and crossed his legs. "No, I don't think so, thanks," he said. "The fact is, I came partly to find out your address, if I might." Mrs. Stapleton rustled and rearranged herself. "Oh, but that's charming of you," she said. "Is there anything particular?" "Yes," said Laurie slowly. "At least, it seems rather particular to me. It's what you were talking about the other day." "Now, how nice of you to say that. Do you know, I was wondering as we talked. Now do tell me exactly what is in your mind, Mr. Baxter." Mrs. Stapleton was conscious of a considerable sense of pleasure. Usually she found this kind of man very imperceptive and gross. Laurie seemed perfectly at his ease, dressed quite in the proper way, and had an air of presentableness that usually only went with Philistinism. She determined to do her best. May I speak quite freely, please? He asked, looking straight at her. Please, please, she said with that touch of childish intensity that her friends thought so innocent and beautiful. Well, it's like this, said Laurie. I've always rather disliked all that kind of thing, more than I can say. It did seem to me so, well, so feeble, don't you know? And then I'm a Catholic, you see, and so, yes, yes. Well, I've been reading Mr. Stinton Moses and one or two other books, and I must say that an awful lot of it seems to me still great rubbish. And then there are any amount of frauds, aren't there, Mrs. Stapleton, in that line? Alas, yes. But then, I don't know what to make of some of the evidence that remains. It seems to me if evidence is worth anything at all, there must be something real at the back of it all. And then, if that is so, if it really is true that it is possible to get in actual touch with people who are dead, I mean really and truly, so that there's no kind of doubt about it, well, that does seem to me about the most important thing in the world. Do you see? She kept her eyes on his face for an instant or two. Plainly, he was really moved. His face had gone a little white in the lamplight, and his hands were clasped tightly enough over his knee to whiten the knuckles. She remembered Lady Laura's remarks about the village girl, and understood. But she perceived that she must not attempt intimacy just yet with this young man. He would resent it. Besides, she was shrewd enough to see by his manner that he did not altogether like her. She nodded pensively once or twice, then she turned to him with a bright smile. I understand entirely, she said. May I, too, speak quite freely? Yes? Well, I am so glad you have spoken out. Of course, we are quite accustomed to being distrusted and feared. After all, it is the privilege of all truth-seekers to suffer, is it not? Well, I will say what is in my heart. First, you are quite right about some of our workers being dishonest sometimes. They are, Mr. Baxter, I have seen more than one myself exposed. But that is natural, is it not? Why, there have been bad Catholics, too, have there not? And after all, we are only human, and there is great temptation sometimes not to send people away disappointed. You have heard those stories, I expect, Mr. Baxter. I have heard of Mr. Eglinton. Ah, poor Willie, yes. But he had great powers for all that. Well, but the point you want to get at is this, is it not? It is really true underneath it all, is that it? Laurie nodded, looking at her steadily. She leaned forward. Mr. Baxter, by all that I hold most sacred, I assure you that it is, that I myself have seen and touched my own father, who crossed over 20 years ago. I have received messages from his own lips, and communications in other ways, too, concerning matters only known to him and to myself. Is that sufficient? No? She held up a delicate silencing hand. No, I will not ask you to take my word. I will ask you to test it for yourself. Laurie, too, leaned forward now in his low chair, his hands clasped between his knees. You will let me test it? He said in a low voice. She sat back easily, pushing her drapery straight. She was in some fine silk that fell straight from her high, slender waist to her copper-colored shoes. Listen, Mr. Baxter. Tomorrow there is coming to this house certainly the greatest medium in London, if not in Europe. Of course, we cannot compete with the East. We are only children beside them. Well, this man, Mr. Vincent, I think I spoke of him to you last week. He's coming here just for a talk to one or two friends. There shall be no difficulty if you wish it. I will speak to Lady Laura before you go. Laurie looked at her without moving. I shall be very much obliged, he said. You will remember that I am not yet in the least convinced. I only want to know. That is exactly the right attitude. That is all we have any right to ask. We do not ask for blind faith, Mr. Baxter, only for believing after having seen. Laurie nodded slowly. That seems to me reasonable, he said. There was silence for a moment, then she determined on a bold stroke. There is someone in particular, Mr. Baxter. Forgive me for asking. Someone who has passed over? She sank her voice to what she had been informed was a sympathetic tone, and was scarcely prepared for the sudden tightening of that face. That is my affair, Mrs. Stapleton. Oh, well, she had been premature. She would fetch Lady Laura, she said. She thought she might venture for such a purpose. No, she would not be away 3 minutes. Then she rustled out. Laurie went to the fire to wait, and stood there, mechanically warming his hands and staring down at that sleeping core of red coal. He had taken his courage in both hands in coming at all. In spite of his brave words to Maggie, he had been conscious of a curious repulsion with regard to the whole matter. A repulsion not only of contempt towards the elaborate affectations of the woman he had determined to consult, yet he had come. What he had said just now had been perfectly true. He was not yet in the least convinced, but he was anxious, intensely and passionately anxious, goaded too by desire. Ah, surely it was absurd and fantastic, here in London, in this century. He turned and faced the lamp-lit room, letting his eyes wander round the picture-hung walls, the blue stamped paper, the Empire furniture, the general appearance of beauty, comfort, and sane modern life. It was absurd and fantastic. He would be disappointed again, as he had been disappointed in everything else. These things did not happen. The dead did not return. Step by step, those things that for centuries had been deemed evidence of the supernatural, one by one had been explained and discounted. Hypnotism, water diving, witchcraft, and the rest. All these had once been believed to be the indisputable proofs of a life beyond the grave, of strange supernormal personalities, and these, one by one, had been either accounted for or discredited. It was mad for him to be alarmed or excited. No, he would go through with it, expecting nothing, hoping nothing, but he would just go through with it to satisfy himself. The door opened, and the two ladies came in. "I'm delighted that you called, Mr. Baxter, and on such an errand." Lady Laura put out a hand, tremulous with pleasure at welcoming a possible disciple. "Mrs. Stapleton has explained," began Laurie. "I understand everything. You come as a skeptic. No, not as a skeptic, but as an inquirer. That is all we wish. Then tomorrow, at about 4:30. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. 1. It was a mellow October afternoon, glowing towards sunset, as Laurie came across the south end of the park to his appointment next day, and the effect of it upon his mind was singularly unsuggestive of supernatural mystery. Instead, the warm sky, the lights beginning to peep here and there, though an hour before sunset, turned him rather in the direction of the natural and the domestic. He wondered what his mother and Maggie would say if they knew his errand, for he had sufficient self-control not to have told them of his intentions. As regards his mother, he did not care very much. Of course, she would deprecate it and feebly dissuade, but he recognized that there was no particular principle behind, beyond a sense of discomfort at the unknown. But it was necessary for him to argue with himself about Maggie. The angry kind of contempt that he knew she would feel needed an answer, and he gave it by reminding himself that she had been brought up in the convent school, that she knew nothing of the world, and that lastly, he himself did not take the matter seriously. He was aware, too, that the instinctive repulsion that she had felt so keenly found a certain echo in his own feelings, but he explained this away by the novelty of the thing. In fact, the attitude of mind in which he more or less succeeded in arraying himself was that of one who goes to see a serious conjurer. It would be rather fun, he thought, to see a table dancing, but there was not wholly wanting that inexplicable tendency of some natures deliberately to deceive themselves on what lies nearest to their hearts. Mr. Vincent had not yet arrived when he was shown upstairs, even though Laurie himself was late. This was partly deliberate. He thought it best to show a little nonchalance. There was only a young clergyman in the room with the ladies, and the two were introduced. "Mr. Baxter, Mr. Jameson." He seemed a harmless young man, thought Laurie, and plainly a little nervous at the situation in which he found himself, as might a greyhound carry himself in a kennel of well-bred foxhounds. He was very correctly dressed, with Roman collar and stock, and obviously had not long left a theological college. He had an engaging kind of courtesy, ecclesiastically cut features, and curly black hair. He sat, balancing a delicate cup adroitly on his knee. "Mr. Jameson is so anxious to know all that is going on," explained Lady Laura with a voluble frankness. He thinks it's so necessary to be abreast of the times, as he said to me the other day." Laurie assented, grimly pitying the young man for his indiscreet confidences. The clergyman looked priggish in his efforts not to do so. "He has a class of young men on Sundays," continued the hostess. "Another biscuit, Maud, darling? Whom he tries to interest in all modern movements. He thinks it so important." Mr. Jameson cleared his throat in a virile manner. "Just so," he said. "Exactly so. And so I told him he must really come and meet Mr. Vincent. I can't think why he is so late, but he has so many calls upon his time that I am sure I wonder." "Mr. Vincent," announced the footman. A rather fine figure of a man came forward into the room, dressed in much better taste than Laurie somehow had expected, and not at all like the type of an insane dissenting minister in broadcloth which he had feared. Instead, it was a big man that he saw, stooping a little, inclined to stoutness, with a full curly beard tinged with gray, rather overhung brows, and a high forehead, from which the same kind of curly grayish hair was beginning to retreat. He was in a well-cut frock coat and dark trousers, with the collar of the period and dark tie. Lady Laura was in a flutter of welcome, pouring out little sentences, leading him to a seat, introducing him, and finally pressing refreshments into his hands. "It is too good of you," she said. "Too good of you with all your engagements. These gentlemen are most anxious. Mrs. Stapleton, of course, you know, and you will just sit and talk with us like friends, won't you? No formal speech at all, just a few words, and you allow us to ask questions," and so on. Meanwhile, Laurie observed the high priest carefully and narrowly, and was quite unable to see any of the unpleasant qualities he had expected. He sat easily, without self-consciousness or arrogance or unpleasant humility. He had a pair of pleasant, shrewd, and rather kind eyes, and his voice, when he said a word or two in answer to Lady Laura's volubility, was of that resonant softness that is always a delight to hear. In fact, his whole bearing and personality was that of a rather exceptional average man, a publisher, it might be, or a retired lawyer, a family man with a sober round of life and ordinary duties, who brought to their fulfillment a wholesome, kindly, but distinctly strong character of his own. Laurie hardly knew whether he was pleased or disappointed. He would almost have preferred a wild creature with rolling eyes and a cloak, yet he would have been secretly amused and contemptuous at such a man. "The sitting is off for Sunday, by the way, Lady Laura," said the newcomer. "Indeed? How is that?" "Oh, there was some mistake about the rooms. It's the secretary's fault. You mustn't blame me." Lady Laura cried out her dismay and disappointment, and Mrs. Stapleton played chorus. It was too tiresome, they said, too provoking, particularly now when Annie was so complacent. Mrs. Stapleton explained kindly to the two young gentlemen that Annie was a spirit who had lately made various very interesting revelations. What was to be done? Were there no other rooms? Mr. Vincent shook his head. It was too late, he said, to make arrangements now. While the ladies continued to buzz, and Mr. Jameson to listen from the extreme edge of his chair, Laurie continued to make mental comments. He felt distinctly puzzled by the marked difference between the prophet and his disciples. These were so shallow, this so impressive by the most ordinary of all methods, and the most difficult of imitation, that is, by sheer human personality. He could not grasp the least common multiple of the two sides. Yet this man tolerated these women, and, indeed, seemed very kind and friendly towards them. He seemed to possess that sort of competence which rises from the fact of having well-arranged ideas and complete certitude about them. And at last a pause came. Mr. Vincent set down his cup for the second time, refused buttered bun, and waited. "Yes, do smoke, Mr. Vincent." The man drew out his cigarette case, smiling, offering it to the two men. Laurie took one. The clergyman refused. "And now, Mr. Vincent." Again he smiled in a half-embarrassed way. "But no speeches, I think you said," he remarked. "Oh, well, you know what I mean. Just like friends, you know? Treat us all like that." Mrs. Stapleton rose, came nearer the circle, rustled down again, and sank into an elaborate silence. "Well, what is it these gentlemen wish to hear?" "Everything, everything!" cried Lady Laura. They claim to know nothing at all. Laurie thought it time to explain himself a little. He felt he would not like to take this man at an unfair advantage. I should just like to say this, he said. I have told Mrs. Stapleton already. It is this. I must confess that so far as I am concerned, I am not a believer. But neither am I a skeptic. I am just a real agnostic in this matter. I have read several books, and I have been impressed. But there's a great deal in them that seems to me nonsense. Perhaps I had better say which I don't understand. This materializing business, for instance. I can understand that the minds of the dead can affect ours, but I don't see how they can affect matter, in table rapping, for instance, and still more in appearing and our being able to touch and see them. I think that's my position, he ended rather lamely. The fact was that he was a little disconcerted by the other's eyes. They were, as I have said, kind and shrewd eyes, but they had a good deal of power as well. Mr. Vincent sat motionless during this little speech, just looking at him, not at all offensively, yet with the effect of making the young man feel rather like a defiant and naughty little boy who was trying to explain. Laurie sat back and drew on his cigarette rather hard. I understand perfectly, said the steady voice. You are in a very reasonable position. I wish all were as open-minded. May I say a word or two? Please. Well, it is materialization that puzzles you, is it? Exactly, said Laurie. Our theologians tell us, by the way, I'm Catholic, the other bowed a little. Our theologians, I believe, tell us that such a thing cannot be except under peculiar circumstances, as in the lives of the saints and so on. Are you bound to believe all that your theologians say? Asked the other quietly. Well, it would be very rash indeed, began Laurie. Exactly, I see. But what if you approach it from the other side and try to find out instead whether these things actually do happen? I do not wish to be rude, Mr. Baxter, but you remember that your theologians, I am not so foolish as to say the church, for I know that that was not so, but your theologians, you know, made a mistake about Galileo. Laurie winced a little. Mr. Jameson cleared his throat in gentle approval. Now, I don't ask you to accept anything contrary to your faith, went on the other gently, but if you really wish to look into this matter, you must set aside for the present all other presuppositions. You must not begin by assuming that the theologians are always right, nor even in asking how or why these things should happen. The point is, do they happen? His last words had a curious little effect, as of a sudden flame. He had spoken smoothly and quietly, then he had suddenly put an unexpected emphasis into the little sentence at the end. Laurie jumped internally. Yes, that was the point, he assented internally. Now, went on the other again in that slow, reassuring voice, flicking off the ash of his cigarette. Is it possible for you to doubt that these things happen? May I ask you what books you have read? Laurie named 3 or 4. And they have not convinced you? Not altogether. Yet you accept human evidence for a great many much more remarkable things than these, as a Catholic. That is divine revelation, said Laurie, sure of his ground. Pardon me, said the other. I do not in the least say it is not divine revelation. That is another question. But you receive the statement that it is so on the word of man. Is that not true? Laurie was silent. He did not quite know what to say, and he almost feared the next words, but he was astonished that the other did not press home the point. Think over that, Mr. Baxter. That is all I ask. And now for the real thing. You sincerely wish to be convinced. I am ready to be convinced. The medium paused an instant, looking intently at the fire. Then he tossed the stump of his cigarette away and lighted another. The 2 ladies sat motionless. You seem to be fond of a priori arguments, Mr. Baxter, he began with a kindly smile. Let us have 1 or 2 then. Consider first the relation of your soul to your body. That is infinitely mysterious, is it not? An emotion rises in your soul, and a flush of blood marks it. That is the subconscious mechanism of your body. But to say that does not explain it. It is only a label. You follow me? Yes? Or still more mysterious is your conscious power. You will to raise your hand, and it obeys. Muscular action. Though yes, but that is but another label. He turned his eyes, suddenly somber, upon the staring, listening young man, and his voice rose a little. Go right behind all that, Mr. Baxter, down to the mysteries. What is that link between soul and body? You do not know, nor does the wisest scientist in the world, nor ever will. Yet there the link is. Again he paused. Laurie was aware of a rising half-excited interest far beyond the power of the words he heard. Yet the manner of these two were striking. It was not the sham mysticism he had expected. There was a certain reverence in them, an admitting of mysteries that seemed hard to reconcile with the ideas he had formed of the dogmatism of these folk. Now, begin again, continued the quite virile voice. You believe, as a Christian, in the immortality of the soul, and the survival of personality after death. Thank God for that. All do not, in these days. Then I need not labor at that. Now, Mr. Baxter, imagine to yourself some soul that you have loved passionately, who has crossed over to the other side. Laurie drew a long, noiseless breath, steadying himself with clenched hands. She has come to the unimaginable glories according to her measure. She is at an end of doubts and fears and suspicions. She knows because she sees. But do you think that she is absorbed in these things? You know nothing of human love, Mr. Baxter. The voice trembled with genuine emotion. If you can think that, if you can think that her thoughts turn only to herself and her joys, why, her life has been lived in your love, by our hypothesis. You were at her bedside when she died, perhaps, and she clung to you as to God himself when the shadow deepened. Do you think that her first thought, or at least her second, will not be of you? In all that she sees, she will desire you to see it also. She will strive, crave, hunger for you, not that she may possess you, but that you may be one with her in her own possession. She will send out vibration after vibration of sympathy and longing, and you, on this side, will be turned to her as none other can be. You, on this side, will be empty for her love, for the sight and sound of her. Is death then so strong, stronger than love? Can a Christian believe that? The change in the man was extraordinary. His heavy beard and brows hid half his face, but his whole being glowed passionately in his voice, even in his little trembling gestures, and Laurie sat astonished. Every word uttered seemed to fit his own case, to express by an almost perfect vehicle the vague thoughts that had struggled in his own heart during this last week. It was Amy of whom the man spoke, Amy with her eyes and hair peering from the glorious gloom to catch some glimpse of her lover in this meaningless light of earthly day. Mr. Vincent cleared his throat a little, and at the sound of the two motionless women stirred and rustled a little. The sound of a handsome, then spanking trot and wintry jingle of bells swelled outside of the distance, passed and went into silence before he spoke again. Then it was in his usual slow voice that he continued. Conceive such a soul as that, Mr. Baxter. She desires to communicate with one she loves on earth, with you or me, and it is a human and innocent desire. Yet she has lost that connection, that machinery of which we have spoken, that connection of which we know nothing between matter and spirit except that it exists. What is she to do? Well, at least she will do this. She will bend every power that she possesses upon that medium, I mean matter, through which alone the communication can be made. As a man on an island beyond the power of a human voice will use any instrument, however grotesque, to signal to a passing ship. Would any decent man, Mr. Baxter, mock at the pathos and effort of that, even if it were some grotesque thing, like a flannel shirt on the end of an oar? Yet men mock at the tapping of a table. Well then, This longing soul uses every means at her disposal, concentrates every power she possesses. Is it so very unreasonable, so very unchristian, so very dishonoring to the love of God, to think that she sometimes succeeds, that she is able, under comparatively exceptional circumstances, to reestablish that connection with material things that was perfectly normal and natural to her during her earthly life? Tell me, Mr. Baxter. Laurie shifted a little in his chair. I cannot say that it is, he said in a voice that seemed strange in his own ears. The medium smiled a little. So much for a priori reasoning, he said. There remains only the fact whether such things do happen or not. There I must leave you to yourself, Mr. Baxter. Laurie sat forward suddenly. But that is exactly where I need your help, sir, he said. A murmur broke from the lady's lips, simultaneously resembling applause. Mr. Jameson sat back and swallowed perceptibly in his throat. You have said so much, sir, went on Laurie deliberately, that you have, so to speak, put yourself in my debt. I must ask you to take me further. Mr. Vincent smiled full at him. You must take your place with others, he said. These ladies. Mr. Vincent, cried Lady Laura. He is quite right. You must help him. You must help us all. Well, Sunday week, he began deprecatingly. Mrs. Stapleton broke in. No, now, Mr. Vincent, now. Do something now. Surely the circumstances are favorable. I must be gone again at 6:30, said the man hesitatingly. Laurie broke in. He felt desperate. If you can show me anything of this, sir, you can surely show it now. If you do not show it now... Well, Mr. Baxter, put in the voice, sharp and incisive, as if expecting an insult and challenging it. Laurie broke down. I can only say, he cried, that I beg and entreat of you to do what you can, now and here. There was silence. And you, Mr. Jameson? The young clergyman started as if from a daze. Then he rose abruptly. I must be going, Lady Laura, he said. I had no idea it was so late. I have a confirmation class. An instant later he was gone. That is as well, observed the medium. And you are sure, Mr. Baxter, that you wish me to try? You must remember that I promise nothing. I wish you to try. And if nothing happens? If nothing happens, I will promise to continue my search. I shall know then that it is at least sincere. Mr. Vincent rose to his feet. A little table just here, Lady Laura, if you please, and a pencil and paper. Will you kindly take your seats? Yes, Mr. Baxter, draw up your chair. Here. Now, please, we must have complete silence and, so far as possible, silence of thought. 2. The table, a small, round rosewood one, stood bare of any cloth upon the hearthrug. The two ladies sat, motionless statues once more, upon the side furthest from the fire, with their hands resting lightly upon the surface. Laurie sat on one side and the medium on the other. Mr. Vincent had received his paper and pencil almost immediately, and now sat resting his right hand with the pencil upon the paper, as if to write, his left hand upon his knee as he sat, turned away slightly from the center. Laurie looked at him closely, and now he began to be aware of a certain quite indefinable change in the face at which he looked. The eyes were open. No, it was not in them that the change lay, nor in the lines about the mouth, so far as he could see them, nor in any detail anywhere. Neither was it the face of a dreamer or a sleepwalker, or of the dead, when the lines disappear and life retires. It was a living, conscious face, yet it was changed. The lips were slightly parted, and the breath came evenly between them. It was more like the face of one lost in deep, absorbed, introspective thought. Laurie decided that this was the explanation. He looked at the hand on the paper, well-shaped, brownish, capable, perfectly motionless, the pencil held lightly between the finger and thumb. Then he glanced up at the two ladies. They, too, were perfectly motionless, but there was no change in them. The eyes of both were downcast, fixed steadily upon the paper, and as he looked, he saw Lady Laura begin to lift her lids slowly, as if to glance at him. He looked himself upon the paper and the motionless fingers. He was astonished at the speed with which the situation had developed. 5 minutes ago, he had been listening to talk and joining in it. The clergyman had been here. He himself had been sitting a yard further back. Now they sat here as if they had sat for an hour. It seemed that the progress of events had stopped. Then he began to listen for the sounds of the world outside, for within here it seemed as if a silence of a very strange quality had suddenly descended and enveloped them. It was as if a section, that place in which he sat, had been cut out of time and space. It was apart here, it was different altogether. He began to be intensely and minutely conscious of the world outside, so entirely conscious that he lost all perception of that at which he stared. Whether it was the paper, or a strong, motionless hand, or the introspective face, he was afterwards unaware. But he heard all the quiet roar of the London evening, and was able to distinguish even the note of each instrument that helped to make up that untiring, inconclusive orchestra. Far away to the northward sounded a great thoroughfare, the rolling of wheels, a myriad of hoofs, the pulse of motor vehicles, and the cries of street boys. Upon all these his attention dwelt as they came up through the outward windows into that dead silent, lamp-lit room of which he had lost consciousness. Again a hansom came up the street, with the rap of hoofs, the swish of a whip, the wintry jingle of bells. He began gently to consider these things, to perceive, rather than to form little inward pictures of what they signified. He saw the lighted omnibus, the little swirl of faces round a newsboard. Then he began to consider what had brought him here. It seemed that he saw himself coming in his dark suit across the park, turning into the thoroughfare and across it. He began to consider Amy, and it seemed to him that in this intense and living silence he was conscious of her for the first time, without sorrow since 10 days ago. He began to consider. Something brought him back in an instant to the room and his perception of it, but he had not had an idea of what this was, whether a movement or a sound. But, on considering it afterwards, he remembered that it was as that sound is that wakes a man at the very instant of his falling asleep, a sharp, momentary tick, as of a clock. Yet he had not been in the least sleepy. On the contrary, he perceived now with an extreme and alert attention the hand on the paper. He even turned his head slightly to see if the pencil had moved. It was as motionless as at the beginning. He glanced up with a touch of surprise at his hostess's face, and caught her in the very act of turning her eyes from his. There was no impatience in her movement. Rather, her face was one of absorbed, listening intently, not like the bearded face opposite, introspective and intuitive, but eagerly, though motionlessly, observant of the objective world. He looked at Mrs. Stapleton. She, too, bore the same expression of intent regarding thought on her usually rather tiresome face. Then, once again, the silence began to come down, like a long, noiseless hush. This time, however, his progress was swifter and more sure. He passed with the speed of thought through those processes that had been measurable before, faintly conscious of the words spoken before the sitting began. If possible, the silence of thought. He thought he understood now what that signified, and that he was experiencing it. No longer did he dwell upon or consider with any voluntary activity the images that passed before him. Rather, they moved past him while he simply regarded them without understanding. His perception ran swiftly outwards, as through concentric circles. Yet he was not sure whether it were outwards or inwards that he went. The roar of London, with its flight of ocular visions, sank behind him, and without any further sense of mental travel, he found himself perceiving his own home. Whether in memory, imagination, or fact, he did not know. But he perceived his mother in the familiar lamp-lit room over her needlework, and Maggie looking at him with a strange, almost terrified expression in her great eyes. Then these two were gone, and he was out in some warm silence, filled with a single presence, that which he desired, and there he stopped. He was not in the least aware of how long this lasted, but he found himself at a certain moment in time, looking steadily at the white paper on the table from which the hand had gone, again conscious of the sudden passing of some clear sound that left no echo, as sharp as the crack of a whip. Oh, the paper. That was the important point. He bent a little closer, and was aware of a sharp disappointment as he saw it was stainless of writing. Then he was astonished that the hand and pencil had gone from it, and looked up quickly. Mr. Vincent was looking at him with a strange expression. At first he thought he might have interrupted, and wondered with dismay whether this were so. But there was no sign of anger in those eyes, nothing but a curious and kindly interest. "Nothing happened?" he exclaimed hastily. "You've written nothing." He looked at the ladies. Lady Laura, too, was looking at him with the same strange interest as the medium. Mrs. Stapleton, he noticed, was just folding up, in an unobtrusive manner, several sheets of paper that he had not noticed before. He felt a little stiff, and moved as if to stand up, but to his astonishment, the big man was up in an instant, laying his hands on his shoulders. "Just sit quietly for a few minutes," said the kindly voice. "Just sit still." "Why? Why?" began Laurie, bewildered. "Yes, just sit still quietly," went on the voice. "You feel a little tired." "Just a little," said Laurie. "But—" "Yes, yes, just sit still. No, don't speak." Then silence fell again. Laurie began to wonder what this was all about. Certainly he felt tired, yet strangely elated, but he felt no inclination to move, and sat back passive, looking at his own hands on his knees. But he was disappointed that nothing had happened. Then the thought of time came into his mind. He supposed that it would be about 10 minutes past 6. The sitting had begun a little before 6. He glanced up at the clock on the mantelpiece, but it was one of those bulgy-faced empire gilt affairs that display everything except the hour. He still waited a moment, feeling all this to be very unusual and unconventional. Why should he sit here like an invalid? And why should these three sit there and watch him so closely? He shifted a little in his chair, feeling that an effort was due from him. The question of the time of day struck him as a suitably conventional remark with which to break the embarrassing silence. "What is the time?" he said. "I'm afraid I ought to be—" "There is plenty of time," said the grave voice across the table. With a sudden movement, Laurie was on his feet, peering at the clock, knowing that something was wrong somewhere. Then he turned to the company, bewildered and suspicious. "Why is it nearly 8?" he cried. Mr. Vincent smiled reassuringly. "It is about that," he said. "Please sit down again, Mr. Baxter." But, but, began Laurie. "Please sit down again, Mr. Baxter," repeated the voice with a touch of imperiousness that there was no resisting. Laurie sat down again, but he was alert, suspicious, and intensely puzzled. "Will you kindly tell me what has happened?" he asked sharply. "You feel tired?" "No, I'm all right. Kindly tell me what has happened." He saw Lady Laura whisper something in an undertone he could not hear. Mr. Vincent stood up with a nod and leaned himself against the mantelpiece, looking down at a rather indignant young man. "Certainly," he said. "You are sure you're not exhausted, Mr. Baxter?" "Not in the least," said Laurie. "Well, then, you passed into trance about 5 minutes." "What?" "You passed into trance about 5 minutes past 6. You came out of it 5 minutes ago." "Trance?" gasped Laurie. "Certainly, a very deep and satisfactory trance. There's nothing to be frightened of, Mr. Baxter. It is an unusual gift, that is all. I have seldom seen a more satisfactory instance. May I ask you a question or two, sir?" Laurie nodded vaguely. He was still trying hopelessly to take in what had been said. "You nearly passed into trance a little earlier. May I ask whether you heard or saw anything that recalled you?" Laurie shut his eyes tight in an effort to think. He felt dimly rather proud of himself. "It was quite short. Then you came back and looked at Lady Laura. Try to remember." "I remember thinking I heard a sound." The medium nodded. Just so, he said. That would be the third, said Lady Laura, nodding sagely. Third what? Said Laurie rather rudely. No one paid any attention to him. Now, can you give any account of the last hour and a half? Continued the medium tranquilly. Laurie considered again. He was still a little confused. I remember thinking about the streets, he said, and then of my own home, and then... He stopped. Yes, and then? Then of a certain private matter. Ah, we must not pry then. But can you answer one question more? Was it connected with any person who has crossed over? It was, said Laurie shortly. Just so, said the medium. Laurie felt suspicious. Why do you ask that? He said. Mr. Vincent looked at him steadily. I think I had better tell you, Mr. Baxter. It is more straightforward, though you will not like it. You will be surprised to hear that you talked very considerably during this hour and a half, and from all that you said, I should suppose you were controlled by a spirit recently crossed over. A young girl who, on being questioned, gave the name of Amy Nugent. Laurie sprang to his feet, furious. You have been spying, sir. How dare you? Sit down, Mr. Baxter, or you shall not hear a word more, rang out the imperious, unruffled voice. Sit down this instant. Laurie shot a look at the two ladies. Then he remembered himself. He sat down. I am not at all angry, Mr. Baxter, came the voice, suave and kindly again. Your thought was very natural, but I think I can prove to you that you are mistaken. Mr. Vincent glanced at Mrs. Stapleton with an almost imperceptible frown, then back at Laurie. Let me see, Mr. Baxter. Is there anyone on earth besides yourself who knew that you had set out, about 10 days ago or so, under some yew trees in your garden at home, and thought of this young girl? That you... Laurie looked at him in dumb dismay. Some little sound broke from his mouth. Well, is that enough, Mr. Baxter? Lady Laura slid in a sentence here. Dear Mr. Baxter, you need not be in the least alarmed. All that has passed here is, of course, as sacred as in the confessional. We should not dream without your leave. One moment, gasped the boy. He drove his face into his hands and sat overwhelmed. Presently he looked up. But I knew it, he said. I knew it. It was just my own self which spoke. The medium smiled. Yes, he said. Of course, that is the first answer. He placed one hand on the table, leaning forward, and began to play his fingers as if on a piano. Laurie watched the movement, which seemed vaguely familiar. Can you account for that, Mr. Baxter? You did that several times. Seemed uncharacteristic of you somehow. Laurie looked at him, mute. He remembered now. He half raised a hand in protest. And do you ever stammer? Went on the man. Still, Laurie was silent. It was beyond belief or imagination. Now, if those things were characteristic... Stop, sir, cried the boy, and then... But those too might be unconscious imitation. They might, said the other. But then we had the advantage of watching you, and there were other things. I beg your pardon? There was the loud, continuous rapping at the beginning and the end. You were awakened twice by these. Laurie remained perfectly motionless, without a word. He was still striving to marshal this flood of mad ideas. It was incredible, amazing. Then he stood up. I must go away, he said. I don't know what to think. You would better stay a little longer and rest, said the medium kindly. The boy shook his head. I must go at once, he said. I cannot trust myself. He went out without a word, followed by the medium. The two ladies sat eyeing one another. It has been astonishing, astonishing, sighed Mrs. Stapleton. What a find! There was no more said. Lady Laura sat as one in trance herself. Then Mr. Vincent returned. You must not lose sight of that young man, he said abruptly. It is an extraordinary case. I have all the notes here, remarked Mrs. Stapleton. Yes, you'd better keep them. He must not see them at present. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. 1. As the weeks went by, Maggie's faint uneasiness disappeared. She was one of those fortunate persons who, possessing what are known as nerves, are aware of their possession and discount their effects accordingly. That uneasiness had culminated a few days after Laurie's departure one evening as she sat with the old lady after tea in a sudden touch of terror at she knew not what. "What is the matter, my dear?" the old lady had said without warning. Maggie was reading, but it appeared that Mrs. Baxter had noticed her lower her book suddenly with an odd expression. Maggie had blinked a moment. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking of Laurie. I don't know why." But since then she had been able to reassure herself. Her fancies were but fancies, she told herself, and they had ceased to trouble her. The boy's letters to his mother were ordinary and natural. He was reading fairly hard. His coach was as pleasant a person as he had seemed. He hoped to run down to Stanton's for a few days at Christmas. There was nothing whatever to alarm anyone. Plainly, his ridiculous attitude about spiritualism had been laid by, and, better still, he was beginning to recover himself after his sorrow in September. It was an unextraordinarily peaceful and uneventful life that the two led together, the kind of life that strengthens previous proclivities and adds no new ones, that brings out the framework of character and motive as dropping water clears the buried roots of a tree. This was all very well for Mrs. Baxter, whose character was already fully formed. It may be hoped, but not so utterly satisfactory for the girl, though the process was pleasant enough. After Mass and breakfast, she spent the morning as she wished, overseeing little extra details of the house, gardening plans, the poultry, and so forth, and reading what she cared to. The afternoon was devoted to the old lady's airing, the evening till dinner to anything she wished, and after dinner again to gentle conversation. Very little happened. The vicar and his wife dined there occasionally, and still more occasionally Father Mahan. Now and then there were vague entertainments to be patronized in the village schoolroom, in an atmosphere of ink and hair oil, and a mild amount of rather dreary and stately gaiety connected with the big houses round. Mrs. Baxter occasionally put in appearances, a dignified and aristocratic old figure with her gentle eyes and black lace veil, and Maggie went with her. The pleasure of this life grew steadily upon Maggie. She was one of that fraction of the world that finds entertainment to lie, like the kingdom of God, within. She did not in the least wish to be amused or stimulated and distracted. She was perfectly and serenely content with the fowls, the garden, her small selected tasks, her religion, and herself. The result was, as it always is in such cases, she began to revolve about 3 or 4 main lines of thought, and to make a very fair progress in the knowledge of herself. She knew her faults quite well, and she was not aware of her virtues. She knew perfectly that she was apt to give way to internal irritation of a strong though invisible kind when interruptions happened, that she now and then gave way to an unduly fierce contempt of tiresome people and said little bitter things that she afterwards regretted. She also knew that she was quite courageous, that she had magnificent physical health, and that she could be perfectly content with a life that a good many other people would find narrow and stifling. Her own character, then, was one thing that she had studied, not in the least in a morbid way, during her life at Stanton's. And another thing she was beginning to study, rather to her own surprise, was the character of Laurie. She began to become a little astonished at the frequency with which, during a silent drive, or some mild mechanical labor in the gardens, the image of that young man would rise before her. Indeed, as has been said, she had new material to work on. She had not realized till the affair, Amy, that boy's astonishing selfishness, and it became for her a rather pleasant psychological exercise to build up his characteristics into a consistent whole. It had not struck her, till this specimen came before her notice, how generosity and egotism, for example, so far from being mutually exclusive, can very easily be complements each of the other. So then she passed her days exteriorly a capable and occupied person, interested in half a dozen simple things, interiorly rather introspective, rather scrupulous, and intensely interested in the watching of two characters, her own and her adopted brother's. Mrs. Baxter's character needed no dissection. It was a consistent whole, clear as crystal and as rigid. It was still some 5 weeks before Christmas that Maggie became aware of what, as a British maiden, she ought, of course, to have known long before, namely, that she was thinking just a little too much about a young man who, so far as was apparent, thought nothing at all about her. It was true that once he had passed through a period of sentimentality in her regard, but the extreme discouragement it had met with had been enough. Her discovery happened in this way. Mrs. Baxter opened a letter one morning, smiling contentedly to herself. "From Laurie," she said. Maggie ceased eating toast for a second to listen. Then the old lady uttered a small cry of dismay. "He thinks he can't come after all," she said. Maggie had a moment of very acute annoyance. "What does he say? Why not?" she asked. There was a pause. She watched Mrs. Baxter's lips moving slowly, her glasses in place, saw the page turned and turned again. She took another piece of toast. There are few things more irritating than to have fragments of a letter doled out piecemeal. "He doesn't say. He just says he's very busy indeed and has a great deal away to make up." The old lady continued, reading tranquilly, and laid down the letter. "Nothing more?" asked Maggie, consumed with annoyance. "He's been to the theater once or twice. Dear Laurie, I'm glad he's recovering his spirits." Maggie was very angry indeed. She thought it abominable of the boy to treat his mother like that. And then there was the shooting. Not much indeed, beyond the rabbits which the man who acted as occasional keeper told her wanted thinning, and a dozen or two of wild pheasants. Yet the shooting had always been done, she understood, at Christmas, ever since Master Laurie had been old enough to hold a gun. She determined to write him a letter. When breakfast was over, with a resolved face, she went to her room. She would really tell this boy a home truth or two. It was a sister's place to do so. The mother, she knew well enough, would do no more than send a little wail, and would end by telling her dear boy that, of course, he knew best, and that she was very happy to think that he was taking such pains about his studies. Someone must point out to the boy his overwhelming selfishness, and it seemed that no one was at hand but herself. Therefore, she would do it. She did it, therefore, politely enough, but unmistakably, and as it was a fine morning, she thought that she would like to step up to the village and post it. She did not want to relent, and once the letter was in the post-box, the thing would be done. It was, indeed, a delicious morning. As she passed out through the iron gate, the trees overhead, still with a few brown belated leaves, soared up in filigree of exquisite workmanship into a sky of clear November blue, as fresh as a hedge sparrow's egg. The genial sound of a cock crowing rose, silver and exultant, from the farm beyond the road, and the tiny street of the hamlet looked as clean as a Dutch picture. She noticed on the right, just before she turned up the village on the left, the grocer's shop, with the name Nugent in capitals as bright and flamboyant as on the depot of the Merchant King. Mr. Nugent could be fairly descried within, in white shirt sleeves and an apron, busied at a pile of cheeses. Overhead, 3 pairs of lace curtains, each decked with a blue bow, denoted the bedrooms. One of them must have been Amy's. She wondered which. All up the road to the village, some half-mile in length, she pondered Amy. She had never seen her to her knowledge, but she had a tolerably accurate mental picture of her from Mrs. Baxter's account. Ah, how could Laurie? How could he? Laurie, of all people! It was just one more example. After dropping her letter into the box at the corner, she hesitated for an instant. Then, with an odd look on her face, she turned sharply aside to where the church tower pricked above the leafless trees. It was a typical little country church, with the odor of the respectable and rather stuffy sanctity peculiar to the class. She had wrinkled her nose at it more than once in Laurie's company, but she passed by the door of it now, and, stepping among the wet grasses, came down the little slope among the headstones to where a very white marble angel clasped an equally white marble cross. She passed to the front of this and looked, frowning a little over the intolerable taste of the thing. The cross, she perceived, was wreathed with a spray of white marble ivory. The angel was a German female, with a very rounded leg emerging behind a kind of button, and there at the foot of the cross was the inscription in startling black: Amy Nugent, the dear and only daughter of Amos and Maria Nugent of Stanton's, died September 21st, 1901. Respected by all. I shall see her, but not now. Below, as vivid as the inscription, there stood out the maker's name and the town where he lived. So she lay there, reflected Maggie. It had ended in that, a mound of earth, cracking a little and sunken. She lay there, her nervous fingers motionless and stammer silent. And could there be a more eloquent monument of what she was? Then she remembered herself and signed herself with the cross, while her lips moved an instant for the repose of the poor girlish soul. Then she stepped up again onto the path to go home. It was as she came near the church gate that she understood herself, that she perceived why she had come, and was conscious for the first time of her real attitude of soul as she had stood there, reading the inscription, and, in a flash, there followed the knowledge of the inevitable meaning of it all. In a word, it was this. She had come there, she told herself, to triumph, to gloat. Oh, she spared herself nothing as she stood there, crimson with shame, to gloat over the grave of a rival. Amy was nothing less than that, and she herself, she, Margaret Marie Derenay, had given way to jealousy of this grocer's daughter, because she had begun to care, really to care, for the man whom she had written that letter this morning, and this man had scarcely said one word to her, or given her one glance, beyond such as a brother might give to a sister. There was the naked truth. Her mind fled back. She understood 100 things now. She perceived that sudden anger at breakfast had been personal disappointment, not at all that lofty disinterestedness on behalf of the mother that she had pretended. She understood, too, now, the meaning of those long, contented meditations as she went up and down the garden walks, alert for plantains, the meaning of the zeal she had shown only a week ago on behalf of a certain hazel which the gardener wanted to cut down. "You had better wait till Mr. Lawrence comes home," she had said. "I think he once said he liked the tree to be just there." She understood now why she had been so intuitive, so condemnatory, so critical of the boy. It was that she was passionately interested in him, that it was a pleasure even to abuse him to herself, to call him selfish and self-centered, that all this lofty disapproval was just the sop that her subconsciousness had used to quiet her uneasiness. Little scenes rose before her, all passed almost in a flash of time, as she stood with her hand on the medieval-looking latch of the gate, and she saw herself in them all as a proud, unmaidenly, farcical prig in love with a man who was not in love with her. She made an effort, unlatched the gate, and moved on, a beautiful, composed figure, with great steady eyes and well-cut profile, a model of dignity and grace, interiorly a raging, self-contemptuous, abject wretch. It must be remembered that she was convent-bred. 2. By the time that Laurie's answer came, poor Maggie had arranged her emotions fairly satisfactorily. She came to the conclusion, arrived at after much heart-searching, that, after all, she was not yet actually in love with Laurie, but was in danger of being so, and that therefore, now that she knew the danger, and could guard against it, she need not actually withdraw from her home, and bury herself in a convent or a foreign mission field. She arrived at this astonishing conclusion by the following process of thought. It may be presented in the form of a syllogism. All girls who are in love regard the beloved as a spotless, reproachless hero. Maggie Derenay did not regard Laurie Baxter as a spotless, reproachless hero. Ergo, Maggie Derenay was not in love with Laurie Baxter. Strange as it may appear to non-Catholic readers, Maggie did not confide her complications to the ear of Father Mahan. She mentioned, no doubt, on the following Saturday that she had given way to thoughts of pride and jealousy, that she had deceived herself with regard to a certain action, done really for selfish motives, into thinking she had done it for altruistic motives, and there she left it. And no doubt Father Mahan left it there too, and gave her absolution without hesitation. Then Laurie's answer arrived and had to be dealt with. That is, it had to be treated interiorly with a proper restraint of emotions. "My dear Maggie," he wrote, "why all this fury? What have I done? I said to Mother that I didn't know for certain whether I could come or not, as I had a lot to do. I don't think she can have given you the letter to read, or you wouldn't have written all that about my being away from home at the one season of the year, etc. Of course, I'll come if you or anybody feels like that. Does Mother feel upset too? Please tell me if she ever feels that, or is in the least unwell, or anything. I'll come instantly. As it is, shall we say the 20th of December, and I'll stay at least a week. Will that do? Yours, L.B." This was a little overwhelming, and Maggie wrote off a penitent letter, refraining carefully, however, from any expressions that might have anything of the least warmth, but saying that she was very glad he was coming, and that the shooting should be seen to. She directed the letter, and then sat for an instant looking at Laurie's, at the neat Oxford-looking hand, the artistic appearance of the paragraphs, and all the rest of it. She would have liked to keep it, to put it with half a dozen others she had from him, but it seemed better not. Then, as she tore it up into careful strips, her conscience smote her again, shrewdly, as she drew out the top left-hand drawer of the table at which she sat. There they were, a little pile of them, neat and orderly. She looked at them an instant, then she took them out, turned them quickly to see if all were there, and then, gathering up the strips of the one she had received that morning, went over to the wood fire and dropped them in. It was better so, she said to herself. The days went pleasantly enough after that. She would not for an instant allow herself that any of their smoothness arose from the fact that this boy would be here again in a few weeks. On the contrary, it was because she had detected a weakness in his regard, she told herself, and had resolutely stamped on it, that she was in so serene a peace. She arranged about the shooting, that is to say, she informed the acting keeper that Master Laurie would be home for Christmas as usual, all in an unemotional manner, and went about her various affairs without effort. She found Mrs. Baxter just a little trying now and then. That lady had come to the conclusion that Laurie was unhappy in his religion, certainly references to it had dropped out of his letters, and that Mr. Rymer must set it right. "The vicar must dine here at least twice while Laurie is here," she observed at breakfast one morning. "He has a great influence with young men." Maggie reflected upon a remark or two extremely unjust made by Laurie with regard to the clergyman. Do you think he understands Laurie?" she said. "He has known him for 15 years, remarked Mrs. Baxter. "Perhaps it's Laurie that doesn't understand him, then," said Maggie tranquilly. "I dare say." "And what do you think Mr. Rymer will be able to do?" asked the girl. "Just settle the boy. I don't think Laurie's very happy. Not that I would willingly disturb his mind again. I don't mean that, my dear. I quite understand that your religion is just the one for certain temperaments, and Laurie's is one of them. But a few helpful words sometimes." Mrs. Baxter left it at an aposiopesis, a form of speech she was fond of. There was a grain of truth, Maggie thought, in the old lady's hints, and she helped herself in silence to marmalade. Laurie's letters, which she usually read, did not refer much to religion, or to the Brompton Oratory, as his custom had been at first. She tried to make up her mind that this was a healthy sign, that it showed that Laurie was settling down from that slight feverishness of zeal that seemed the inevitable atmosphere of most converts. Maggie found converts a little trying now and then. They would talk so much about facts, certainly undisputed, and for that very reason not to be talked about. Laurie had been a marked case, she remembered. He wouldn't let the thing alone, and his contempt for Anglican clergy, whom Maggie herself regarded with respect, was hard to understand. In fact, she had remonstrated on the subject of the vicar. Maggie perceived she was letting her thoughts run again on disputable lines, and she made a remark about the Balkan crisis so abruptly that Mrs. Baxter looked at her in bewilderment. "You do jump about so, my dear. We were speaking of Laurie, were we not?" "Yes," said Maggie. "It's the 20th he's coming on, is it not?" "Yes," said Maggie. "Wonder what train he'll come by." "I don't know," said Maggie. A few days before Laurie's arrival, she went to the greenhouse to see the chrysanthemums. There was an excellent show of them. "Mrs. Baxter doesn't like them hairy ones," said the gardener. "Oh, I had forgotten. Well, Ferris, on the 19th I shall want a big bunch of them. You'd better take those hairy ones, and some maidenhair. Is there plenty?" "Yes, miss." "Can you make a wreath, Ferris?"
"Yes, miss."
"Well, will you make a good wreath of them, please, for a grave? The morning of the 20th will do. There'll be plenty left for the church and house."
"Oh, yes, miss."
"And for Father Mahan?"
"Oh, yes, miss."
"Very well, then. Will you remember that? A good wreath with fern on the morning of the 20th? If you'll just leave it here, I'll call for it about 12 o'clock. You needn't send it up to the house."
End of chapter 5.